Through a narrow canyon where sunlight dances on rose-hued stone, time itself seems suspended. A whispering silence hangs between towering cliffs, interrupted only by the soft echo of ancient footsteps that no longer fall. Here, where the desert meets artistry, where water once flowed through ingenious channels beneath a scorching sky, lies Petra, a dream carved into reality by hands long returned to dust. Its facades sleep eternally in sandstone, waiting for twilight when the rosy glow deepens to blood red and the city of ghosts awakens in memory. The wind carries stories of caravans laden with frankincense and myrrh, of kings who ruled from thrones of stone, of a civilization that found paradise in the most unforgiving landscape. Sleep now, as we journey through the veiled pathways of the Rose City, where even time has learned to stand still. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. Before the first chisel ever struck sandstone, before the first merchant caravan paused to rest in its shade, before the name Petra was whispered in reverence across ancient trade routes, there existed only the timeless dialogue between stone and water. The story of Petra begins not with human hands, but with the patient artistry of geological forces working across millions of years to create the perfect canvas for a civilization that would one day make this harsh wilderness their home. The landscape that would cradle Petra began forming during the late Precambrian era, roughly 600 million years ago. Deep beneath what would eventually become the Arabian Peninsula, powerful tectonic forces were at work, slowly folding and compressing ancient seabeds into new formations. Layer upon layer of sediment accumulated, compressed, and hardened into the sandstone that would one day define the visual identity of the Rose City. The most distinctive feature of Petra's geology, the magnificent multicolored sandstone, originated during the Paleozoic era. As ancient rivers flowed across what was then a vast flat plain, they deposited fine-grained sand in extensive sheets. These sands, rich in minerals like iron and manganese, would eventually transform into the banded rose, white and rust-colored sandstone that gives Petra its nickname, the Rose City. The iron compounds in the stone oxidized over time, creating the dramatic reddish hues, while manganese contributed deep purples and blues that swirl through the rock like painted brush strokes. The most dramatic geological event in the region's history came much later, during the Tertiary period approximately 30 million years ago, when the Great Rift Valley began to form. This massive geological fault line extends from the Jordan Valley through the Red Sea and into East Africa. As the Arabian Plate slowly pulled away from the African plate, the land between fractured and subsided, creating a series of dramatic valleys, gorges, and depression zones. It was this tectonic activity that created the dramatic topography that would later prove so crucial to Petra's development and defense. The most iconic entrance to Petra, the Sikh, owes its existence to these same tectonic forces. Originally just a vast crack in the earth created by these geological movements, the Sikh was further carved by the seasonal waters of Wadi Musa. For millions of years, flash floods rushed through this narrow passage, gradually widening and smoothing its walls, while carrying away debris. The result was a natural corridor, in some places only a few meters wide, with walls towering up to 180 meters high, a dramatic and defensible entrance to what would one day become a thriving city. These geological processes created more than just impressive scenery. The unique hydrology of the region produced several natural springs that would later make human habitation possible in this otherwise arid region. Water from these springs, combined with the seasonal rains that fell primarily in winter months, created a landscape that, while challenging, contained the essential resources necessary for human settlement. The earliest evidence of human presence in the area dates to the Paleolithic period, approximately 100,000 years ago. Archaeological excavations have revealed stone tools near what would later become Petra, suggesting that nomadic hunter-gatherers passed through the region, perhaps following migrating game or seeking seasonal water sources. These early humans left little permanent mark on the landscape, moving with the rhythms of nature rather than attempting to reshape it to their needs. By the Neolithic period, around 8,500 BCE, more substantial evidence of human settlement begins to appear. At this time, the climate of the region was notably wetter than it is today. Archaeological evidence suggests small agricultural communities began to emerge in the broader region, with people cultivating early varieties of wheat and barley in the more fertile valleys, while still relying heavily on hunting. The transition to the Bronze Age, beginning around 3000 BCE, brought more sophisticated societies to the region surrounding Petra. The area that would eventually become Edom began to host more permanent settlements. The hill country east of what would become Petra saw the development of small villages, with stone structures and evidence of more organized agricultural activities. These communities were still relatively small and isolated, but they represent an important step toward the more complex societies that would later emerge. By the Iron Age, 1200–586 BCE, the region had become part of the territory of Edom, mentioned in biblical texts. The Edomites developed copper mining and smelting operations in the nearby Wadi Araba, establishing some of the earliest industrial activities in the region. Their knowledge of metallurgy and water management would later influence the development of technologies that made life in Petra possible. The Edomites established small settlements in and around what would later become Petra, though these were modest compared to what would follow. Archaeological evidence suggests they primarily used the area for seasonal pastoralism, moving their herds between higher and lower elevations according to the season. The narrow valley, with its reliable water source, would have provided an excellent shelter for both people and animals during harsh weather. Around 600 BCE, a significant shift occurred in the region as the Edomite kingdom declined, partly due to pressure from the expanding Babylonian Empire. Into this power vacuum moved groups of nomadic Arab traders, the forerunners of what would eventually become the Nabataean civilization. These early proto-Nabataeans did not immediately establish permanent settlements, instead continuing their mobile lifestyle while gradually increasing their control over regional trade routes. Unlike the agricultural communities that preceded them, these nomadic traders recognized a different kind of value in the landscape. The area that would become Petra sat at a critical juncture of emerging trade routes connecting Arabia to the Mediterranean, Egypt to Syria. The deep canyons and hidden valleys offered not only water but security, places where valuable trade, goods could be safely stored away from raiders and where traders themselves could find shelter. By the 4th century BCE, these nomadic traders had begun to establish more permanent presences in the area. Simple structures appeared, most likely storehouses for trade goods and seasonal residences. The process was gradual. The transition from a fully nomadic lifestyle to a settled urban one would take generations to complete. But with each passing decade, the attachment to this particular landscape grew stronger. The climate during this early period of settlement was marginally wetter than it is today, with slightly more reliable seasonal rainfall. Even so, water management quickly became a central concern for anyone seeking to establish a permanent community in this environment. The early proto-Nabataeans began to experiment with simple water collection systems, digging cisterns to capture and store rainwater and directing seasonal flows toward areas where they could be most useful. What they found in this seemingly inhospitable canyon was a landscape of possibility. The soft sandstone could be easily worked with relatively simple tools. Natural caves could be expanded into storage chambers or living spaces. The narrow sick provided a natural defensive barrier that could be guarded by just a handful of people, securing the valley from unwanted visitors. And the natural springs, while not abundant, provided enough water to sustain a modest population, especially when supplemented with well-designed water catchment systems. As the 4th century BCE progressed, more elaborate structures began to appear in the valley. Simple tombs were carved into the soft sandstone cliffs, marking a deeper connection to the landscape. These early tombs lacked the elaborate facades that would characterize later Nabataean architecture, but they represent an important psychological shift. The people who created them intended not just to live in this place, but to remain here even after death. The landscape was becoming not just a convenient location, but a sacred space, a permanent home. The true architects of Petra's grandeur were the Nabataeans, a remarkable people whose journey from desert nomads to master builders of an urban civilization represents one of the most fascinating cultural transformations in ancient history. Their origins remain somewhat mysterious, cloaked in the shifting sands of the Arabian desert and obscured by their initial reluctance to leave written records. Yet through archaeological discoveries and the accounts of their contemporaries, the story of their emergence has gradually come into clearer focus. The Nabataeans first appear in historical records in 312 BCE, when they were mentioned by Diodorus. Siculus, drawing on the now lost work of Hieronymus of Cardia, Hieronymus had accompanied Antigonus the Monophthalmus, one of Alexander the Great's successors, in a failed military expedition against these desert people. What emerges from this account is an image of a fiercely independent nomadic society with distinct customs and a remarkable ability to thrive in the harsh desert environment. Linguistically and culturally, the Nabataeans were Arabs, sharing many cultural traits with other Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. They spoke a form of Old North Arabian, which they wrote in an Aramaic script, a practical choice that reflected their engagement with wider regional trade networks, where Aramaic served as a lingua franca. This pragmatic approach to cultural borrowing and adaptation would become a defining characteristic of Nabataean civilization. In their earliest phase, the Nabataeans were primarily nomadic pastoralists and traders, moving through the deserts with their herds of camels and goats. They developed exceptional knowledge of the sparse water sources throughout the region, information they guarded jealously from outsiders. Ancient accounts describe how they created hidden cisterns in the desert, covered to prevent evaporation, and known only to members of their community, a survival strategy that gave them mastery over landscapes that others found impassable. The Nabataeans emerged during a period of significant political transformation in the Near East. Alexander the Great's conquests had shattered older political structures, and in the resulting vacuum, new powers were establishing themselves. The Ptolemaic dynasty had taken control of Egypt, while the Seleucids dominated Syria and Mesopotamia. These Hellenistic kingdoms sought to control the lucrative trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with Arabia, India, and beyond. It was in this context that the Nabataeans found their opportunity. Positioned between these competing powers, they established themselves as middlemen in the trade of valuable Arabian commodities, particularly frankincense and myrrh, aromatic, resins used in religious ceremonies, funeral rites, and as luxury medicinal items throughout the Mediterranean world. These precious substances were harvested in southern Arabia, modern Yemen and Oman, and transported northward by caravan. The demand for these aromatics was immense in the ancient world. Temples throughout Egypt, Greece, and Rome burned vast quantities of incense in religious rituals. The embalming practices of Egypt required myrrh. Wealthy households used these aromatics to perfume their dwellings and their bodies. This trade was so valuable that Pliny the Elder later lamented the drain on the Roman economy caused by the purchase of these luxury goods from Arabian and Indian sources. The Nabataeans inserted themselves into this lucrative trade network not just as transporters but as essential facilitators. They provided water, shelter, and protection to caravans crossing the harsh desert terrain for a price. Their intimate knowledge of water sources and desert paths made them indispensable partners. Over time, they extended their control across major portions of the trade routes, establishing way stations and trading posts. Rather than simply serving as escorts for others' goods, the Nabataeans gradually became traders in their own right, purchasing aromatics from their sources in southern Arabia and transporting them to Mediterranean markets at considerable profit. They also diversified their trade portfolio, dealing in spices from India, silk from China, arriving via Indian Ocean trade routes, bitumen from the Dead Sea, used for waterproofing and embalming, and various minerals and metals extracted from the regions they controlled. As their wealth grew, the Nabataeans began to transition from a purely nomadic lifestyle toward a more settled existence. Though this was a gradual process that unfolded over several generations, even as they established permanent settlements, many Nabataeans continued to maintain aspects of their nomadic heritage, with some portions of the community still practicing seasonal migrations with their herds well into the period of their greatest urban development. The earliest permanent Nabataean settlements in the Petra region likely began as seasonal encampments near reliable water sources, gradually becoming more established over time. By the late 3rd century BCE, archaeological evidence suggests more substantial structures were being built in the valley, though these early buildings were still relatively modest. Many combined built structures of stone and wood with expanded, natural caves and rock shelters, a pragmatic approach that utilized the natural advantages of the landscape. The political organization of the early Nabataeans seems to have been tribal in nature, with authority vested in a council of elders and tribal chiefs. As their society grew more complex, a more centralized form of leadership emerged, eventually developing into a hereditary monarchy. The first Nabataean king, whose name is known with certainty, is Aretas I, who is mentioned in historical sources from around 168 BCE when he offered refuge to the Jewish high priest Jason. This emerging kingdom faced significant external pressures. The Seleucid Empire initially attempted to assert control over the lucrative trade routes dominated by the Nabataeans. Later, as Seleucid power waned, the expanding influence of the Roman Republic and its client states presented new challenges. The neighboring Hasmonean Jewish kingdom also occasionally came into conflict with the Nabataeans over territorial control and trade rights. Despite these pressures, the Nabataeans managed to maintain their independence through a combination of military defense, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic alliances. When direct confrontation was unavoidable, they used their intimate knowledge of the desert environment to their advantage, employing hit-and-run tactics and retreating to inaccessible strongholds when faced with superior forces. More often, however, the Nabataeans preferred diplomatic solutions. They paid tribute when necessary, formed alliances with stronger powers when advantageous, and generally sought to maintain their autonomy through compromise rather than conflict. Their wealth made them valuable economic partners for the larger empires that surrounded them, creating incentives for these powers to allow the Nabataeans considerable autonomy in managing their internal affairs and trade networks. The early Nabataean religious practices reflected their nomadic origins, with worship centered on a pantheon of deities associated with natural features, celestial bodies, and aspects of their daily existence. Their chief deity was Dushara, a god associated with mountains and the sky, whose name means Lord of the Mountain. Al-Uzza, a powerful goddess with associations to fertility and protection, was another primary deity. As they encountered other cultures through trade, the Nabataeans demonstrated remarkable religious syncretism, absorbing and adapting elements from Egyptian, Greek, and Roman religious traditions. Initially, Nabataean worship did not require elaborate temples or structures. Sacred spaces might be marked by standing stones, beetles, or simple altars in natural settings. As their society became more sedentary and prosperous, however, they began to create more formal religious spaces, eventually developing the monumental temples that would become architectural highlights of their settlements. The earliest material culture of the Nabataeans was relatively simple, reflecting their nomadic lifestyle. Pottery was practical and portable, textiles served multiple purposes, and personal adornments were limited to items that could be easily transported. As they accumulated wealth and established permanent settlements, however, their material culture became increasingly sophisticated. Nabataean pottery, in particular, underwent a remarkable transformation. From simple utilitarian wares, their ceramics evolved into extraordinarily fine, thin-walled vessels decorated with delicate painted designs. At its most refined, Nabataean eggshell pottery had walls less than 2 mm thick, a technical achievement that demonstrates the high level of craftsmanship their settled lifestyle made possible. Unlike many aspects of their culture that showed strong foreign influences, their distinctive pottery tradition appears to have been a largely indigenous development. The The transition from nomadic traders to settled urbanites did not happen overnight, nor did it occur uniformly across Nabataean society. Archaeological evidence suggests that even during the height of their architectural achievements in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, elements of Nabataean society maintained seasonal mobility, moving between permanent structures in their cities and tent encampments in the surrounding countryside according to traditional patterns and economic needs. This gradual transformation is reflected in their early architectural choices at Petra. The earliest substantial structures were practical in nature: water cisterns, storage facilities, and simple dwellings. Many early habitations combined built elements with natural cave features, reflecting a transitional approach to permanent settlement. Even their earliest tombs, carved into the sandstone cliffs, were relatively simple in design compared to the elaborate facades that would come later. By the late 2nd century BCE, however, the Nabataeans were beginning to demonstrate greater architectural ambition. The influence of Hellenistic styles, encountered through trade contacts and diplomatic exchanges, became increasingly evident in their buildings. They adapted these foreign architectural traditions to their own purposes and environmental conditions, creating a distinctive synthesis that would reach its fullest expression in the monumental facades carved into the cliffs of Petra. The transformation of Petra from a seasonal trading post to a magnificent desert capital was not the result of a single founding event, but rather an organic evolution spanning generations. As the Nabataeans gradually shifted from their nomadic origins toward a more settled existence, they began to recognize and develop the unique potential of the site that would become their greatest achievement. The precise moment when Petra became the official capital of the Nabataean kingdom is difficult to pinpoint with absolute certainty. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the late 4th to early 3rd century BCE, the site had already become an important center for the Nabataeans, though the scale of settlement was still modest compared to what would follow. The earliest substantial structures in the valley likely served primarily as secure storage facilities for trade goods and as seasonal residences rather than as permanent dwellings for a large population. What drew the Nabataeans to establish their capital in this particular location was a combination of practical considerations, strategic advantages, and natural resources. The site offered remarkable defensive benefits. Nestled within a ring of rugged sandstone mountains and accessible primarily through the narrow SIQ, a natural corridor that could be easily defended by a small force, Petra provided security for both the Nabataean people and their valuable trade goods. The presence of reliable water sources was equally crucial. The spring at Ain Musa provided a consistent supply of fresh water, a precious resource in this arid region. The seasonal water flows through Wadi Musa could be captured and stored with appropriate engineering, creating water security even during dry periods. For a people who had mastered the art of finding and managing water in desert environments, the hydrological potential of the site must have been immediately apparent. Petra's geographic position also gave it tremendous commercial significance. It sat at the intersection of several major trade routes: the King's Highway running north-south along the Highland Plateau, connecting Syria with the Red Sea and Egypt, and the routes coming from Arabia in the east, carrying precious frankincense and myrrh toward Mediterranean markets. By establishing their capital at this crossroads, the Nabataeans could effectively control and tax the flow of valuable goods. The earliest phase of settlement likely consisted of simple structures combined with the use of natural caves, some of which were expanded for additional storage or living space. Some evidence suggests that even in this early period, the Nabataeans were beginning to experiment with water management techniques, creating simple channels and cisterns to capture and store rainwater. As the 3rd century BCE progressed, the settlement began to take on a more permanent character. More substantial buildings appeared, constructed of local sandstone blocks. The earliest tombs were carved into the cliffs surrounding the valley, though these lacked the elaborate facades that would characterize later burials. These early tombs, simple chambers cut into the rock, nonetheless represent an important psychological shift. indicating a people who now viewed this location as their permanent home, a place where their ancestors would rest for eternity. Under the leadership of the early Nabataean kings, whose names and exact reigns remain somewhat obscure in historical records, the settlement expanded from its initial core. The first king, known with certainty, Aretas I, mentioned in historical sources around 168 BCE, likely presided over a Petra that was already showing signs of urban development, though still far from the architectural splendor it would eventually achieve. By the early 2nd century BCE, Petra was emerging as not just a trading post, but a true urban center, with distinct zones for commercial, residential, ceremonial, and funerary purposes. The central area of the valley was gradually developed into what would eventually become the city's civic center, with public buildings and markets. The surrounding hillsides, with their potential for rock-cut architecture, were increasingly utilized for tombs and some religious structures. During this period of early development, the Nabataeans were beginning to establish the sophisticated water management systems that would become one of their most impressive achievements. Building on their traditional knowledge of desert hydrology, they created channels to divert the seasonal flash floods that rush through the sick, directing this valuable water into cisterns and reservoirs, where it could be stored for use during dry periods. These early waterworks were continually expanded and refined over subsequent generations. The Nabataeans excavated cisterns throughout the city and its surroundings, some capable of holding thousands of gallons of water. They built dams to control water flow and prevent destructive flooding. Ceramic pipes were installed to distribute water to public fountains and some private residences. These hydraulic achievements transformed what might otherwise have been an occasionally watered desert valley into a year-round oasis capable of supporting thousands of inhabitants. The defensive potential of the site was enhanced with strategic construction. While Petra's natural topography provided excellent protection, the Nabataeans supplemented these advantages with walls and watchtowers at vulnerable points. The entrance through the Sik was controlled by gates and guard posts, allowing the Nabataeans to regulate who entered their capital. As the city grew in population and importance during the 2nd century BCE, the architecture became increasingly ambitious. The influence of Hellenistic styles, encountered through trade and diplomatic contacts with the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kingdoms, began to appear in Nabataean buildings. Yet the Nabataeans were not simply imitating foreign styles. They were adapting these influences to their own aesthetic sensibilities and the practical requirements of their environment. This syncretic approach to architecture would reach its fullest expression in the elaborate facades carved into the sandstone cliffs, work that likely began in a modest way in the 2nd century BCE, but would reach its peak of sophistication in the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE. The iconic Treasury, Al-Khazna, though constructed later, represents the culmination of architectural techniques and stylistic approaches that were being developed during these formative periods. The religious landscape of the city also evolved during this founding period. Early worship likely centered on simple altars and sacred spaces, often associated with natural features like prominent rocks, springs, or high places with commanding views. Over time, more formal temples and sanctuaries were established. The primary deity, Dushara, received particular veneration, with sacred precincts dedicated to his worship. The goddess Al-Uzza also had significant cult centers within the developing city. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, under kings like Aretas II, reigned c. 120 and 96 BCE, Petra had established itself as a significant urban center and the unquestioned capital of the expanding Nabataean kingdom. The population likely numbered several thousand permanent residents, with additional seasonal inhabitants and a constant flow of traders and visitors. The economic foundation of this growth remained the lucrative trade in aromatics, spices, and luxury goods. Nabataean merchants organized caravans that traversed the dangerous desert routes, bringing frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, spices from India, silk from distant China, and many other exotic commodities destined for eager markets in Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean world. Petra served as both the administrative center for this trade network and a major marketplace where goods could be bought, sold, and transferred. Caravans arriving from the east would rest and resupply in the city before continuing their journeys northward or westward. Taxes and customs duties collected from this trade filled the royal treasury, funding further urban development and architectural projects. The wealth generated by trade fostered the development of specialized crafts and industries within the city. Potters produced the increasingly refined ceramics that would become a hallmark of Nabataean material culture. Metalworkers created tools, weapons, and decorative items. Textile production, leatherwork, and other crafts flourished, meeting both local needs and producing goods for trade. Housing in this early period ranged from modest dwellings utilizing natural cave features to more substantial constructed buildings for the elite. Archaeological evidence suggests that even during this early phase, some wealthier residences featured decorated walls, imported luxury items, and comfortable appointments. For the majority of the population, however, accommodations were more basic, reflecting the practical needs of a trading society still connected to its nomadic roots. By the reign of Aretas, 4c. 96 to 85 BCE, Petra had become a symbol of Nabataean identity and power, a physical manifestation of their transformation from desert nomads to urban sophisticates. The city represented a unique synthesis of indigenous Arab traditions, with selected elements adopted from the wider Hellenistic world. This cultural hybridity would remain a defining characteristic of Nabataean civilization throughout its golden age. The founding period established patterns of urban development that would guide Petra's growth for generations to come. The central valley would continue to serve as the civic and commercial heart of the city. The surrounding cliffs would be increasingly utilized for monumental tombs and some religious structures. Water management would remain a central preoccupation, with systems continually expanded and refined to support the growing population. Most importantly, this founding era established Petra as more than just a settlement. It became the spiritual and cultural center of the Nabataean people. As their capital city took shape among the rose-colored cliffs, the Nabataeans created a place that expressed their newfound identity as urban dwellers while honoring their desert heritage. The city became both a practical center of administration and trade, and a symbolic representation of Nabataean achievement and aspiration. As the 1st century BCE dawned, Petra stood poised at the threshold of its greatest period of prosperity and architectural achievement. The foundations had been laid, the essential character of the city had been established. In the generations that followed, under the rule of kings like Aretas III and Aretas IV, this foundation would support an extraordinary flowering of urban life and monumental construction that would create the Petra we recognize today. A wonder of the ancient world whose rose-red ruins continue to astonish modern visitors. What began as a convenient stopping place for desert caravans had evolved into one of the most remarkable urban centers of the ancient Near East. The Nabataeans, drawing on their intimate knowledge of their environment and their strategic position within regional trade networks, had transformed a challenging landscape into a thriving city. The experiment in urban living that began in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE would continue to develop and expand, reaching its zenith in the century before Roman annexation forever changed the trajectory of Nabataean civilization. As the 1st century BCE dawned over the sandstone cliffs of Petra, the Nabataean settlement was transforming from a simple trading post into the capital of a prosperous kingdom. The Nabataeans' political ascendancy did not happen suddenly, but evolved gradually through skillful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and careful navigation of the complex geopolitical landscape of the ancient Middle East. From their stronghold, in Petra, they extended their influence across vast territories, establishing one of the most remarkable pre-Islamic Arab kingdoms in history. Nabataean power reached its zenith under the rule of King Aretas III, known as Philhellene, or Lover, of Greek culture. During his reign from approximately 87 to 62 BCE, The Nabataeans controlled territories extending from Damascus in the north to the Hejaz in the south, and from the Negev Desert in the west to the Arabian Desert in the east. This vast realm incorporated major trade routes connecting Arabia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. Aretas III understood the power of cultural adaptation and began the process of Hellenization that would characterize much of later Nabataean art and architecture, while still maintaining the unique Nabataean identity. On quiet evenings in Petra, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the narrow gorges and temple facades, one might have glimpsed the silent movements of royal messengers carrying diplomatic correspondence to distant kingdoms. The Nabataeans practiced a sophisticated form of statecraft, forming alliances when beneficial and maintaining neutrality when necessary. Their position along crucial trade routes gave them significant leverage in regional politics, as great powers like Rome and Parthia both sought favorable relations with these masters of the desert highways. The Nabataean political structure evolved into a monarchy that balanced royal authority with tribal traditions. While the king held supreme power, he ruled with the counsel of a group of advisors that likely represented the interests of prominent Nabataean families and clans. This system allowed for stable governance while preserving the social cohesion that had served the Nabataeans well during their earlier nomadic existence. Royal succession typically passed from father to son, though not without occasional disputes that echoed through the carved halls of Petra. Aretas IV. Philopatris, whose name means lover of his people, ascended to the Nabataean throne in 9 BCE and would rule for nearly 5 decades until 40 CE. His long and relatively peaceful reign marked the golden age of the Nabataean kingdom. Under his guidance, Petra flourished as never before. The city expanded, grand monuments were carved from the living rock, and Nabataean influence reached its geographical zenith. Coinage from his reign shows his portrait alongside that of his queen, suggesting the important role royal women played in Nabataean society and governance. The royal court at Petra became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Diplomatic protocols were established, royal regalia developed, and court ceremonies formalized. The king would receive foreign emissaries in grand audience chambers, impressing visitors with displays of wealth and cultural refinement. These encounters were carefully choreographed to project Nabataean power and prestige to the wider world, establishing Petra as not merely a wealthy trading center, but as the capital of a significant regional power. Yet the Nabataean kingdom did not exist in isolation. To the north and west loomed the ever-expanding Roman Empire, whose appetite for new territories seemed insatiable. Roman interest in the region increased as the empire sought to secure its eastern frontiers and gain control over lucrative trade routes. The Nabataeans found themselves engaged in a delicate diplomatic dance, maintaining their independence while acknowledging Roman power. In 64 to 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey reorganized Syria and much of the Near East under Roman control. While the Nabataeans maintained their independence, they increasingly found themselves within Rome's sphere of influence. The kingdom became a client state of Rome, maintaining internal autonomy while coordinating foreign policy with Roman interests. This arrangement proved beneficial for several generations, allowing the Nabataeans to prosper under Roman protection while avoiding direct Roman rule. The administrative structure of the Nabataean kingdom reflected its position as a trading nation. Officials oversaw customs posts at key locations, collecting tariffs that formed a significant portion of royal revenue. The kingdom was divided into districts for administrative purposes, each with appointed officials responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and implementing royal decrees. A system of royal roads connected Petra to outlying settlements, allowing for efficient communication and movement of troops when necessary. Law and justice in the Nabataean kingdom followed, traditions that blended local customs with influences from neighboring civilizations. Royal judges dispensed justice in the king's name, and evidence suggests a sophisticated legal system that addressed everything from commercial disputes to personal injuries. Written contracts, some preserved on papyrus and others inscribed on stone, show that legal transactions were formalized and recorded for posterity. Throughout the 1st century CE, the Nabataean kingdom maintained its prosperity despite the changing regional dynamics. King Malichus II ruled from approximately 40 to 70 CE, followed by Rabel II Sota, the savior, who would be the last Nabataean monarch. During these final decades of independence, the shadow of Rome grew longer across the sandstone cliffs of Petra. The kingdom's leadership seems to have recognized the inevitability of Roman annexation and focused on preserving cultural identity and economic prosperity in the face of political change. Rabel II's reign lasted from 70 to 106 CE, and historical evidence suggests he moved the administrative capital from Petra to Bosra in southern Syria during the latter part of his rule. This strategic decision may have reflected changing trade patterns or an attempt to position the kingdom's center farther from Roman territories. Despite this partial relocation, Petra remained the spiritual and cultural heart of the Nabataean realm, its temples and tombs continuing to receive royal patronage. As the 1st century CE drew to a close, the Nabataeans had accomplished something remarkable. They had transformed themselves from desert nomads into the masters of a wealthy kingdom, with a distinctive culture and sophisticated political system. Their capital at Petra stood as a testament to this transformation, its rose-colored facades and ingenious water systems, reflecting a people who had learned to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. Yet political success breeds envy, and the wealth of the Nabataean kingdom drew increasingly covetous glances from Rome. The Roman Emperor Trajan, pursuing an aggressive policy of eastern expansion, turned his attention to the Nabataean realm in the early 2nd century CE. In 106 CE, without apparent military conquest, the kingdom was annexed and transformed into the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. The circumstances of this annexation remain somewhat mysterious, with some scholars suggesting it may have been anticipated by Rabel II's death without a clear successor, while others propose a more forceful Roman takeover. With the Roman annexation, the independent political history of the Nabataean kingdom came to an end. The administrative center of the new province was established at Bosra rather than Petra, reflecting the northward shift in regional importance that had already begun during Rabel II's reign. Yet Petra remained a significant city within the new Roman province, adapting to its changed circumstances while preserving much of its cultural heritage. As darkness fell over the sandstone cliffs each night, the stars wheeled above a city in transition. The Nabataean royal dynasty had passed into history, but their greatest monument, the city of Petra itself, continued to stand as a testament to their political achievement. The silent facades carved into the rock would outlast empires and kingdoms alike, preserving the memory of Nabataean statecraft for thousands of years. In the harsh environment of the Jordanian desert, where rainfall is scarce and seasonal, the Nabataeans' most remarkable achievement was perhaps their mastery of water. Their water management systems in Petra represented one of the ancient world's most sophisticated hydraulic engineering accomplishments, transforming an arid gorge into a verdant city capable of supporting thousands of inhabitants and hosting countless trade caravans. This mastery of water was not merely technical, but reflected a profound understanding of hydrology, geology, and environmental management that was centuries ahead of its time. The terrain surrounding Petra receives less than 6 inches of rainfall annually, with most precipitation occurring during brief, intense winter storms. These downpours could quickly transform the dry wadis, valleys, into raging torrents, threatening both life and property. The Nabataeans recognized both the destructive and life-giving potential of these waters and developed a comprehensive system to protect the city from flash floods while capturing and storing every precious drop for future use. Their approach began with careful watershed management in the hills surrounding Petra. Archaeological evidence reveals a network of small dams, terraces, and channels in the highlands that serve to slow runoff, reduce erosion, and direct water to collection points. These watershed interventions prevented destructive flash floods while maximizing water harvesting, demonstrating an ecological awareness that would impress modern environmental engineers. Perhaps nowhere was Nabataean water engineering more visible than in their transformation of the Sick, the narrow gorge that serves as the main entrance to Petra. This natural formation, created by tectonic forces that split the sandstone mountain, could become a deadly channel for floodwaters during storms. The Nabataeans lined portions of the Syke with water-resistant cement and constructed an elaborate system of dams, barriers, and diversion tunnels to control water flow through this critical passageway. Along the walls of the Syke, they carved channels to collect water and direct it to cisterns for storage. These channels, some still visible today, ran for hundreds of meters along the Syke's walls, conducting water from catchment areas to storage facilities. In places, terracotta pipes were embedded in these channels, allowing water to flow more efficiently and with less evaporation. At specific intervals, settling basins removed silt and debris, ensuring the water remained clean as it moved through the system. The scale of the Nabataean water infrastructure becomes even more impressive within Petra itself. Archaeological investigations have revealed a complex network of dams, channels, cisterns, and pipes throughout the city. One of the most significant elements was a series of dams across Wadi Musa, the main valley running through Petra. These dams created reservoirs that served multiple purposes. They protected lower portions of the city from flooding, created reserves of water for dry periods, and formed artificial lakes that enhanced the city's microclimate and aesthetic appeal. The Nabataeans' understanding of hydraulic principles was sophisticated. They constructed pipelines with precisely calculated gradients to maintain water flow without excessive pressure. Some pipelines featured pressure reduction chambers where water could dissipate energy safely before continuing its journey. They understood concepts like water hammer, pressure surges, and developed systems to minimize these potentially damaging forces. Storage was another crucial element of the Nabataean water system. Throughout Petra, archaeologists have documented hundreds of cisterns carved into the sandstone. These range from small household reservoirs holding a few cubic meters to massive public cisterns capable of storing thousands of gallons. Many cisterns were covered to reduce evaporation and maintain water quality, and some featured multiple chambers that allowed sediment to settle before water reached the main storage area. The interiors of these cisterns were carefully waterproofed, using a hydraulic plaster made from lime mixed with crushed ceramics, ash, and other additives. This waterproof lining prevented precious water from seeping into the porous sandstone and inhibited the growth of algae and other microorganisms. Some cisterns show evidence of periodic cleaning and maintenance, indicating a sophisticated understanding of water quality management. Distribution of water throughout the city involved an equally impressive network of pipes, channels, and aqueducts. Water from higher elevations was directed to public fountains, bathhouses, pools, and private homes through a gravity-fed system. Terracotta pipes transported water underground, protecting it from contamination and evaporation. At key locations, distribution basins allowed water to be allocated according to need and priority, with public facilities typically receiving first access. The Nabataeans also developed technologies for water lifting, allowing them to raise water from lower to higher elevations when necessary. Archaeological evidence suggests they employed various mechanical devices, including animal-powered water wheels, and possibly the Archimedean screw, to move water uphill for irrigation and domestic use. This comprehensive water management system transformed Petra from a dry gorge into what ancient visitors described as a paradisiacal oasis. Historical accounts speak of gardens, fountains, and pools throughout the city, creating a microclimate that contrasted sharply with the surrounding desert. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Visitors approaching through the parched landscape would have experienced the city as a miraculous haven of greenery and flowing water. The Nabataeans' water mastery extended beyond infrastructure to cultural practices. Water conservation was embedded in daily life through customs and regulations that prevented waste and pollution. Public baths were designed to minimize water use while maintaining hygiene. Gardens employed efficient irrigation techniques that delivered water directly to plant roots. Even the selection of plants for public and private gardens reflected water conservation principles, with drought-tolerant species predominating. Archaeological evidence suggests that water access in Petra followed a hierarchical pattern, with public fountains ensuring basic access for all residents, while wealthier households enjoyed private connections. This arrangement balanced equity and privilege in a way that maintained social harmony while acknowledging differences in status. During drought periods, evidence indicates that water rationing systems went into effect, with priority given to drinking water over other uses. The Nabataeans' water engineering was not static, but evolved over centuries in response to changing conditions and growing knowledge. Early systems focused primarily on basic collection and storage, while later developments introduced more sophisticated filtering, pressure management, and distribution technologies. This evolution reflects a culture of innovation and adaptation that allowed the Nabataeans to thrive in their challenging environment. Perhaps most remarkably, the Nabataean water system was designed for sustainability and resilience. Unlike some ancient hydraulic civilizations that ultimately collapsed due to environmental degradation, the Nabataeans created infrastructure that worked in harmony with natural cycles and could be maintained indefinitely with proper care. Many elements of their water system continued to function long after the Nabataean kingdom itself had passed into history, serving subsequent Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic inhabitants of the region. The ingenuity of Nabataean water management extended beyond Petra itself to satellite settlements throughout their territory. At Humaima, Sabra, and other Nabataean outposts, similar water collection and storage systems allowed for human habitation in otherwise inhospitable locations. This network of water-secure settlements facilitated trade and communication across the kingdom, contributing significantly to Nabataean prosperity and power. As the sun set each evening over Petra, casting long shadows across the facades and temples, the sound of water would have been a constant companion to city life. From the gentle splash of fountains in public squares to the controlled flow through channels and pipes, water, tamed and directed by Nabataean ingenuity, created the soundtrack for urban existence in this desert capital. The simple act of drinking clean water in this arid environment represented a daily miracle, a testament to human creativity and determination. Modern water engineers studying the remains of Nabataean systems continue to express amazement at their sophistication. The precision of their gradients, the durability of their waterproofing techniques, and the holistic integration of watershed management with urban water supply offer lessons that remain relevant in our age of increasing water scarcity. In many ways, the Nabataeans' approach to water represented not just adaptation to their environment, but a profound respect for this most precious resource, an attitude that contemporary societies might well emulate. As night fell over ancient Petra, with stars reflecting in the still waters of cisterns and reservoirs, the city rested secure in its mastery of the desert's greatest challenge. The Nabataeans had not merely survived in this harsh environment. They had transformed it through knowledge, ingenuity, and persistence. Their water systems stand as perhaps their greatest legacy, less visible than the magnificent facades, but equally impressive as a testament to human ingenuity. As dawn broke over the mountains surrounding Petra, the first rays of sunlight would touch the highest points of the sandstone cliffs, gradually illuminating their layered bands of color. Whites, yellows, and most famously, the rich pinks and reds that gave Petra its romantic nickname, the Rose City. But what truly distinguished Petra was not the natural beauty of its setting, remarkable as that was, but the way the Nabataeans transformed this geological canvas through architectural vision and technical skill, carving magnificent facades and structures directly into the living rock. The development of Petra's rock-cut architecture did not happen overnight, but evolved over centuries as Nabataean wealth increased, and cultural influences from across the ancient world flowed into the city along with trade goods. The earliest carved structures in Petra were relatively simple, functional tombs and shrines with minimal decoration. Over time, as prosperity grew, and the Nabataeans encountered the architectural traditions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, their own style evolved into something unique yet cosmopolitan, a distinctive fusion that reflected their position at the crossroads of civilizations. The sandstone that forms the mountains around Petra provided an ideal medium for their architectural ambitions. Relatively soft and workable when freshly exposed, it gradually hardens with exposure to air, creating structures of surprising durability. The varied colors of the stone, resulting from different mineral contents, particularly iron oxides, allowed for naturally polychromatic architecture, with bands of color highlighting different elements of a facade without the need for paint or other applied decoration. The process of creating Petra's rock-cut monuments represented an extraordinary technical achievement. Nabataean stone masons typically worked from top to bottom, carefully removing material to reveal the desired form within the cliff face. They employed a variety of tools, including metal chisels, picks, and hammers, evidence of which can still be seen in tool marks preserved on unfinished structures. The precision of their work is remarkable, particularly given the challenging working conditions on vertical cliff faces, often at considerable heights. Scaffolding was essential for this work, and archaeological evidence suggests the Nabataeans developed sophisticated temporary wooden structures that allowed masons to access the entire facade during carving. The logistics of such construction projects were complex, involving teams of workers with different specializations, from those who removed the bulk of the stone to skilled artists who carved the finer details of columns, capitals, and decorative elements. Among the most magnificent examples of Nabataean rock-cut architecture is the structure known as Al-Khazna, or the Treasury, emerging suddenly into view as visitors exit the narrow SIQ. This facade stands nearly 40 meters high, its rose-colored surface adorned with columns, pediments, and sculptures that blend Hellenistic and Near Eastern influences. Despite its popular name, Al-Khazna was likely not a treasury, but a royal tomb, possibly for King Aretas IV, carved in the 1st century CE. The treasury's design features a lower level with a central doorway flanked by columns and semi-columns, above which rises a second story dominated by a central tholos, a circular structure, topped by an urn or capital. Figures of the goddess Al-Uzza, associated with the Greek Aphrodite, eagles representing divine protection, and other symbolic elements adorn the facade. The precision of the carving is such that delicate details of acanthus, leaves on Corinthian, capitals and the folds of stone drapery on carved figures remain clearly visible after 2 millennia of weathering. The interior spaces behind these magnificent facades are often surprisingly modest, typically simple rectangular chambers with few architectural elaborations. This contrast between elaborate exterior and plain interior has led some scholars to suggest that Nabataean architecture prioritized public display over private experience, reflecting a culture deeply engaged with questions of status, memory, and legacy. Beyond the treasury, Petra contains over 800 identified monuments, each reflecting different periods, purposes, and stylistic influences. The street of facades features a series of tomb entrances carved into the cliff face, their designs, showing the evolution of Nabataean architectural style over time. Some display simple Assyrian influences with crow-step patterns, while others show more complex Hellenistic elements with pediments, pilasters, and decorative friezes. The massive facade known as Ad-Dir, or the monastery, represents another pinnacle of Nabataean rock-cut architecture. Located high in the hills and requiring a strenuous climb to reach, this monument is even larger than the treasury, with a facade measuring 47 meters wide and 48 meters high. Despite its common name, archaeological evidence suggests it was likely a temple dedicated to the deified Nabataean king, Obodas. rather than a monastery, though it may have been repurposed for Christian use in the Byzantine period. The monasteries. Design is simpler than the treasuries, with clean lines and less sculptural decoration, yet its scale and setting create an equally powerful impression. The massive doorway leads to a single large chamber with a small altar niche, suggesting its use for religious ceremonies. The open plaza before the facade could accommodate large gatherings, indicating its importance as a site of public ritual. Not all of Petra's architectural wonders were carved from living rock. The city also featured numerous freestanding structures built using conventional construction techniques. These included temples, public buildings, colonnaded streets, and an impressive theatre carved partially into the hillside with seating for several thousand spectators. These structures employed cut stone blocks, often with elaborately carved details, and incorporated architectural elements from various traditions, particularly Hellenistic and Roman. The Great Temple Complex, located in the city centre, exemplified this freestanding architecture. Covering over 7,000 square meters, it featured a monumental stairway leading to a colonnaded lower temenos, sacred precinct, and an upper temenos with the temple proper. Recent archaeological work suggests this structure may have served not only religious functions, but also as an administrative and governmental center, perhaps housing the Nabataean Royal Audience Hall. Nabataean domestic architecture in Petra combined rock-cut elements with conventional construction. Wealthier residences often featured rooms carved into the cliff face, extended outward with built structures of stone and other materials. These homes incorporated courtyards for light and ventilation, sophisticated water collection systems, and in some cases, private gardens. The integration of built and carved spaces created unique living environments that took advantage of the site's natural characteristics, while providing comfortable accommodation adapted to the desert climate. Throughout Petra, Nabataean architects demonstrated remarkable attention to environmental conditions. Buildings were oriented to maximize shade during the hot summer months, while capturing warming sunlight in winter. Rooms were positioned to take advantage of natural cooling breezes. Water features were incorporated not just for practical purposes, but to create evaporative cooling effects. This environmental sensitivity reflected the Nabataeans' deep understanding of their desert homeland and their commitment to creating comfortable living spaces within it. The decoration of Petra's monuments reflected the Nabataeans' position at the crossroads of cultural influences. Carved capitals might display classical Corinthian acanthus leaves alongside native desert plants. Figurative elements combined Greek and Near Eastern stylistic traditions. Geometric patterns reminiscent of Arabian designs appeared alongside naturalistic elements from Hellenistic art. This eclecticism wasn't merely decorative, but reflected the Nabataeans' cosmopolitan outlook and their role as intermediaries between different cultural worlds. Color was an important element of Nabataean architecture, though much of the original painting has been lost to time and weathering. Archaeological evidence suggests that some facades were enhanced with applied pigments, creating polychromatic effects that would have been even more dramatic than the natural variations in the sandstone. Traces of red, blue, yellow, and gold have been detected on various monuments, indicating a vibrant original appearance quite different from the weathered stone visible today. The effort required to create Petra's monumental architecture represents an extraordinary commitment of resources. Each major facade required thousands of person-hours of skilled labor, sophisticated planning, and considerable financial investment. That the Nabataeans chose to devote so much of their wealth to creating these enduring monuments speaks to the importance they placed on commemorating their dead, honoring their deities, and displaying their cultural achievements to visitors and future generations. As Petra prospered and absorbed influences from other cultures, its architectural style evolved. Early monuments display predominantly Near Eastern characteristics, with simple geometric forms and minimal decoration. Later facades show increasing Hellenistic influence, with classical columns, pediments, and figurative elements becoming common. By the late 1st century CE, Roman architectural elements had begun to appear, reflecting the growing Roman presence in the region even before formal annexation in 106 CE. What makes Petra's architecture truly remarkable is not just its technical accomplishment or aesthetic beauty, but its harmonious integration with the natural landscape. The Nabataeans didn't impose their vision on nature, but worked with it, using the unique qualities of the site to enhance their architectural creations. The result is a city that seems to grow organically from the rock itself, where the boundaries between natural and human-made blur into a seamless whole. As the sun moved across the sky each day, Petra's facades would transform in the changing light. Morning might reveal subtle details lost in the noonday glare. Afternoon light would deepen the rose colors to fiery reds and purples. Sunset might catch west-facing monuments in a final blaze of glory before darkness fell. This daily cycle of revelation and concealment, this partnership between human art and natural light, made Petra a city that was never quite the same from one hour to the next, a place of perpetual discovery. When darkness finally enveloped the city, the stone that had absorbed the day's heat would radiate it slowly back, warming the night air. Under starlight, the monumental facades would stand as silent sentinels, their precise details melting into shadow while their massive outlines remained, testaments to human creativity and ambition carved into the very bones of the earth. Golden streams of sunlight fell in shifting patterns through the narrow canyons leading to Petra, illuminating the well-worn paths that had carried fortunes for generations. Just as the Nabataeans had shaped the very rock of their city, so too had they carved pathways of commerce across the ancient world. These invisible highways of exchange, stretching like arteries from the heart of Petra to distant lands, gave life to the Rose City and transformed a settlement of nomads into a crossroads of civilizations. The strategic position of Petra, nestled between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, placed it at the nexus of several ancient trade routes. To the west lay Egypt and the Mediterranean ports. To the east stretched the vast expanses leading to Mesopotamia and beyond to the kingdoms of India and China. To the south wound the paths to Arabia and its precious incense, and to the north stood the wealthy cities of Syria and Asia Minor. In this intersection of pathways, the Nabataeans found their fortune. The Nabataean control of trade was no accident of geography alone, but the result of careful strategy. The people who had once been desert wanderers understood the rhythm of the sands, the location of every life-giving well, and the patterns of seasonal winds. This knowledge transformed into power as they positioned themselves as essential middlemen in the vast network of ancient commerce. The wealth of Petra flowed not merely from the goods that passed through its markets, but from the services the Nabataeans provided: guidance, protection, water, and shelter for caravans that would otherwise be at the mercy of the harsh desert. Foremost, among the treasures that passed through Petra's gates was frankincense. This aromatic resin, harvested from the boswellia trees of southern Arabia, was worth more than gold by weight in many ancient markets. The sacred smoke of frankincense rose. In temples from Egypt to Rome, its fragrant clouds believed to carry prayers to the gods. The demand seemed endless, and the supply was controlled by a carefully guarded route that inevitably passed through lands where the Nabataeans held sway. Similarly valued was myrrh, another resin from Arabia used in perfumes, medicines, and embalming. The Nabataeans collected taxes on every caravan laden with these precious substances, growing wealthy on the devotions and vanities of far-off peoples. A single camel caravan might carry frankincense worth the equivalent of several years' wages for an ordinary worker, and dozens of such caravans might pass through Petra's control in a single season. Beyond the treasures of Arabia, the Nabataeans facilitated the movement of goods from the east: silks from China, spices from India, pearls from the Persian Gulf. All found their way into the markets of the Mediterranean through routes controlled by the merchants of Petra. From the north and west came glassware, fine textiles, wine, and olive oil, while Egypt provided grain, papyrus, and worked gold. The business of trade was not merely about moving goods from one place to another. but about adding value along the way. Nabataean merchants became skilled negotiators and linguistic intermediaries, often speaking several languages to facilitate transactions between parties who could not directly communicate. They developed sophisticated contracts and financial arrangements, sometimes even offering forms of insurance against the loss of goods in transit. As wealth accumulated in Petra, so did the apparatus for its management. By the 1st century BCE, a complex system of taxation had developed. Customs duties were collected at checkpoints along the trade routes, with receipts written on papyrus or potsherds. These receipts have been discovered by archaeologists, offering glimpses into the volume and variety of goods passing through Nabataean hands. The kingdom maintained officials specifically tasked with collecting these taxes, and the revenues funded both the royal court and the increasingly elaborate public works that made Petra famous. Archaeological evidence reveals the surprising reach of Nabataean trade connections. Coins from Petra have been found as far away as Italy in Central Asia. Distinctive Nabataean pottery, with its remarkably thin walls and fine decoration, has been discovered across the Middle East and Mediterranean, demonstrating that the Nabataeans exported not only the goods of others, but products of their own creation. The scale of Nabataean involvement in trade becomes clear when considering historical accounts. The Roman natural philosopher Pliny wrote of the enormous wealth of the Nabataeans, noting that their control of the aromatics trade made them the richest race on earth. When the Romans eventually annexed the Nabataean kingdom in 106 CE, they gained access to trade routes worth countless millions in modern terms. The Nabataeans did not merely profit from their position, they transformed the very nature of trade in the region. They established way stations and caravanserais across their territory, creating safe havens in the wilderness where merchants could rest, replenish water supplies, and shelter their goods. These way stations often grew into settlements in their own right, gradually extending Nabataean influence across the deserts of what is now Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Sinai. Of these way stations, none was more important than Petra itself. The city functioned as a vast emporium where goods could be stored, displayed, traded, and taxed. Merchants from different lands met in its markets, exchanging not only material goods, but ideas, stories, and beliefs that enriched the cultural fabric of the Rose City. The architecture of Petra reflects this commercial prosperity. The wide colonnaded street that bisects the city centre was lined with shops and market stalls. The remains of these commercial establishments show evidence of storage facilities, display counters, and workshops where artisans could modify imported goods to suit local tastes. As wealth poured into Petra, banking services emerged to manage the flow of capital. Some evidence suggests that the Nabataeans developed sophisticated financial tools, including early forms of letters of credit that allowed merchants to travel without carrying large amounts of currency. The temples of Petra, particularly those dedicated to Dushara, may have served secondary functions as treasuries and banks, with priests acting as financial administrators. Nabataean wealth manifested in conspicuous consumption and display. The elaborate facades of Petra's tombs are perhaps the most visible evidence of this prosperity. Families competed to create ever more impressive final resting places, with architectural elements borrowed from Egyptian, Hellenistic, and Roman traditions combined in unique ways that showcased both wealth and cosmopolitan taste. This international outlook was reflected in the material culture of everyday life in Petra. Excavations of domestic quarters have revealed imported glass from Alexandria, fine ceramics from Greece, textiles from Damascus, and even pepper from India. The elite of Nabataean society surrounded themselves with the finest goods from across the known world, creating homes that were museums of global culture. Beyond the city itself, the Nabataeans invested their commercial profits in agricultural development. The hinterlands of Petra were transformed through sophisticated irrigation works, terracing of hillsides, and careful management of soil and water resources. Vineyards and orchards flourished in areas that might otherwise have been marginally productive, providing both food security and additional export goods. While trade brought prosperity, it also created vulnerabilities. The Nabataean economy was highly dependent on the continued flow of goods through their territories, making them sensitive to disruptions caused by political changes, conflicts, or shifts in demand. This dependency would eventually contribute to the kingdom's decline when new trade routes emerged that bypassed their territories. Yet in the golden age of Petra, from approximately the 1st century BCE to the early 2nd century CE, the city stood as one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan centers in the ancient world. Its markets buzzed with a dozen languages as traders haggled over silks and spices, craftsmen shaped imported raw materials into finished goods, and the treasuries of the king swelled with tax revenues from the endless stream of caravans. As the soul, gentle evening light filtered through the rose-colored canyons, casting long shadows across Petra's open spaces. The city transformed. The bustling commerce of daylight hours gave way to a different rhythm, one of conversation, contemplation, and communion. In the shade of colonnaded porticos, amid the scent of burning incense and the distant notes of music, the cultural life of Petra unfolded like a rare desert bloom, complex and beautiful in its many layers. The religious life of the Nabataeans formed the foundation of their cultural identity. At the heart of their spiritual world stood Dushara, the supreme deity whose name meant Lord of the Mountain. Worshipped primarily as a god of mountains and storms, Dushara was later associated with the Greek Zeus and Roman Jupiter as Hellenistic influences permeated Nabataean culture. His presence in Petra was felt everywhere, from the monumental temple dedicated to him in the city center to the countless small niches carved into the sandstone cliffs, where devotees left offerings and prayers. Perhaps equally important was the goddess Al-Uzza, often identified with the evening star. Her name meant the most mighty, and she was associated with fertility, protection, and justice. In later periods, as Greek cultural elements were adopted, she became partially identified with Aphrodite. Representations of Al-Uzza have been found carved on the facade of the Treasury, suggesting her central role in Nabataean spiritual life. Other significant deities included Al-Qutbay, the god of writing and commerce, Manat, goddess of fate, and Hubal, associated with divination. The Nabataean approach to religion was characterized by pragmatism and adaptability. As they encountered other cultures through trade, they readily incorporated useful elements into their own practices. This syncretic approach is visible in their religious architecture, which blended local traditions with Hellenistic and Egyptian motifs. Sacred spaces in Petra ranged from formal temples with classical colonnades to simple open-air high places where rituals were performed under the vast desert sky. These high places represent some of the most interesting religious sites in Petra, reached by climbing steep, winding paths carved into the mountains. These platforms offered commanding views of the surrounding landscape. At the most famous of these, Jabal Madbar, archaeologists have found an altar flanked by a large triclinium, a formal dining space where ritual meals would have been shared by worshippers. The presence of channels carved into the stone suggests that libations of wine or blood from sacrifices once flowed across these sacred heights. Religious rituals punctuated the Nabataean calendar, with festivals marking seasonal changes, astronomical events, and historical commemorations. Contemporary accounts describe processions through the city, with participants carrying sacred objects and images of deities. Music played an important role in these ceremonies, with drums, flutes, and lyres accompanying hymns and prayers. The acoustics of Petra's natural amphitheaters would have amplified these sounds, creating immersive religious experiences. Beyond formal religion, everyday spirituality permeated Nabataean life. Household shrines have been found in residential excavations, suggesting that family-based worship was common. Amulets, protective inscriptions, and small figurines of deities have been discovered throughout the city, testifying to the importance of personal devotional practices alongside public ceremonies. The artistic expressions of the Nabataeans reveal a culture that valued beauty and craftsmanship. Their most visible art form, the monumental facades carved into living rock, represents a unique aesthetic that combined influences from multiple traditions while maintaining a distinctive local character. These facades, with their columns, pediments, and decorative elements, were not merely functional structures, but statements of cultural identity, religious devotion, and social status. Nabataean sculptors worked not only in monumental scale, but also created smaller works of remarkable subtlety. Statues representing deities, rulers, and mythological figures have been found throughout Petra. These sculptures show the progressive influence of Hellenistic artistic conventions, particularly in their treatment of drapery and facial features, while maintaining certain stylistic elements that mark them as distinctly Nabataean. Perhaps the most distinctive artistic achievement of the Nabataeans was their fine-painted pottery. Created from the 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE, this remarkably thin-walled ceramic ware, sometimes called eggshell pottery because of its delicacy, featured elaborate painted decorations in reddish-brown on a pale background. Geometric patterns, floral motifs, and occasionally animal figures adorned these vessels, which required exceptional skill to produce. The technical mastery involved in creating walls sometimes only 1.5 millimeters thick, while maintaining structural integrity, speaks to the sophisticated craft traditions that evolved in Petra. The visual arts were complemented by a rich tradition of poetry and oral storytelling, though little of this literary heritage has survived. What remains are primarily inscriptions, both formal dedicatory texts on public monuments and casual graffiti scratched into rock surfaces by ordinary citizens and visitors. These inscriptions, written in the distinctive Nabataean script that would later evolve into the Arabic alphabet, offer tantalizing glimpses into everyday thoughts, concerns, and aspirations. Music and dance held important places in Nabataean culture, both in religious contexts and as entertainment. Archaeological finds include fragments of instruments, while carvings and paintings depict musicians and dancers. The theatre at Petra, though constructed in the Roman period, likely hosted performances that combined local traditions with imported theatrical forms. This 4,000-seat structure, carved directly from the mountainside, suggests the importance of public performances and gatherings in the social life of the city. The daily life of Petra's inhabitants varied greatly depending on social status and occupation. At the apex of society stood the royal family and nobility, who lived in elaborate mansions adorned with imported luxuries. Archaeological excavations of elite homes have revealed mosaic floors, painted walls, and sophisticated heating systems that provided comfort even during cool desert nights. Below the nobility were the merchant classes, whose prosperity waxed and waned with the fortunes of trade. These families lived in substantial stone houses, often constructed around central courtyards that provided private outdoor space sheltered from the heat and dust of the city. The homes of successful merchants might include reception rooms for entertaining business associates, private bathing facilities, and domestic shrines. Craftspeople formed another important segment of Petra's population. Potters, metalworkers, stonecutters, textile makers, and other specialists lived in neighborhoods often organized around their professions. Their homes typically combined living spaces with workshops, particularly for crafts that did not require extensive facilities. Archaeological evidence shows that some craft families maintained their specializations across multiple generations, passing techniques and trade secrets from parent to child. At the foundation of the social pyramid were laborers, servants, and slaves who performed the physically demanding work that kept the city functioning. These individuals lived in simple dwellings, sometimes little more than single-room structures with minimal furnishings. Yet even at this social level, archaeological finds suggest personal touches, small decorative objects, simple jewelry, and tokens of religious devotion that humanize these anonymous workers across the centuries. The cuisine of Petra reflected both local resources and imported luxuries. The staple diet consisted of flatbreads, legumes, olives, and dairy products from goats and sheep. Meat was consumed more sparingly, with lamb and goat being the most common choices. Fish, despite the distance from the sea, appears occasionally. In the archaeological record, preserved through salting and drying for transport from coastal regions, the wealthy supplemented these basics with imported delicacies, wines from Greece and Italy, exotic fruits and spices from India that transformed simple meals into gastronomic experiences. Meals in Nabataean culture were not merely about sustenance, but served important social functions. Evidence suggests that formal dining played a role in cementing business relationships and political alliances. The triclinium, a three-sided arrangement of couches around a central space for serving food, appears frequently in Petra's architecture. These dining spaces, found in both private homes and public contexts, allowed participants to recline while eating, a practice adopted from Hellenistic customs that signified sophistication and leisure. Clothing among the Nabataeans combined practical desert attire with fashionable elements borrowed from trading partners. Basic garments consisted of loose-fitting tunics and robes that provided protection from the sun, while allowing air circulation in the hot climate. For ordinary citizens, these were made from locally produced wool and linen. The elite, however, draped themselves in imported silks, fine Egyptian linens, and garments dyed with expensive purple extracted from Mediterranean mollusks. Jewelry was widely worn by both men and women, with archaeological finds including rings, bracelets, anklets, and elaborate headdresses that indicated the wearer's status. The educational practices of the Nabataeans remain somewhat mysterious, but the widespread literacy evidenced by inscriptions suggests formalized instruction for at least some segments of society. Children of the elite likely received education in languages, mathematics, and other subjects necessary for commerce and diplomacy. The Nabataean script, a flowing cursive derived from Aramaic but developing its own distinct characteristics, was taught to those involved in trade, administration, and religious practices. Multilingualism was common in Petra, reflecting its position as a crossroads of cultures. While Nabataean Aramaic served as the primary language, evidence suggests that Greek became increasingly important during the Hellenistic period, particularly for international commerce. Latin gained prominence after Roman annexation, though it never fully displaced local languages. This linguistic diversity echoed through the streets and markets, where conversations might shift between multiple tongues within a single transaction. The governance of Petra evolved from tribal structures to a complex monarchy with bureaucratic institutions. The king, traditionally from the Aretas dynasty, several rulers bore this name, held supreme authority, but typically ruled through a council of advisors drawn from noble families. Administrative positions became increasingly specialized over time, with officials responsible for tax collection, water management, religious activities, and diplomatic relations. Justice in Nabataean society operated through a combination of tribal custom and formalized legal codes. Inscriptions mention officials with judicial responsibilities, suggesting an organized legal system. Cases involving commerce seem to have been particularly well developed, with procedures for resolving contract disputes, assessing damages, and enforcing agreements between parties from different cultural backgrounds. The shadow of Rome had long stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, touching kingdoms and city-states one by one, incorporating them into its ever-expanding embrace. For generations, the Nabataeans had observed this pattern from a comfortable distance, maintaining their independence through a delicate balance of diplomacy, strategic alliance, and occasional tribute. But as the first century of the Common era drew to a close, that shadow finally fell across the rose-red cliffs of Petra, bringing an end to independence and ushering in a profound transformation of Nabataean society. The relationship between Rome and the Nabataean kingdom had always been complex. As early as 65 BCE, the Roman general Pompey had dispatched lieutenants to investigate this wealthy desert kingdom, weighing the benefits of conquest against the costs of controlling such remote territory. The Nabataeans, sensing the danger, moved quickly to establish themselves as friends and allies of Rome rather than potential conquests. King Aretas III and his successors carefully cultivated this relationship, sending valuable gifts to Roman officials and offering assistance to Roman campaigns in the region. This strategy of friendly accommodation served the Nabataeans well for over a century. They maintained their autonomy while benefiting from Roman protection against other potential threats. Roman influence gradually permeated Nabataean culture, visible in everything from architectural styles to fashion and cuisine among the elite. Many wealthy Nabataeans sent their children to be educated in Rome or other major cities of the empire, creating a generation increasingly comfortable with Roman customs and values. Yet beneath this apparently harmonious relationship lay fundamental tensions. Rome's appetite for territorial expansion was seldom permanently sated, and the wealth of the Nabataean kingdom, particularly its control of valuable trade routes, made it an eternally tempting prize. For Rome, client kingdoms were always seen as temporary arrangements, useful until direct administration became more advantageous. The turning point came in 106 CE during the reign of Emperor Trajan. The death of the last Nabataean king, Rabble II, presented an opportunity that Rome swiftly seized. The details of the annexation remain somewhat murky in historical records. Some ancient sources suggest a peaceful transfer of power, perhaps even arranged through Rabble's will. Others hint at military action, though no major battles are recorded. Archaeological evidence indicates that the transition involved some violence, with damage to certain structures dating to this period, but nothing suggesting a prolonged or particularly bloody conquest. What seems most likely is that Rome executed a carefully planned operation, moving troops into key positions throughout Nabataean territory, while simultaneously negotiating with elements of the Nabataean elite who had already been Romanized in outlook. The kingdom's military forces, never particularly large and possibly divided in loyalty by this point, offered limited resistance before accepting the inevitable. With the annexation complete, Trajan established the new Roman province of Arabia, Petra, with Petra serving initially as its capital, though administrative functions would later shift to Bosra in what is now southern Syria. The province encompassed most of the former Nabataean kingdom, including territories in modern Jordan, southern Syria, the Negev, and northwestern Saudi Arabia. A new era had begun, marked by the instruments of Roman rule: legionary garrisons, imperial governors, standardized laws, and reorganized taxation. For the citizens of Petra, the immediate effects of annexation were mixed. The city's physical appearance began to change as Roman architectural preferences were imposed on the urban landscape. The main colonnaded street was widened and paved in the Roman fashion. New public buildings appeared, including baths and administrative structures that reflected Roman concepts of civic space. The theatre, already influenced by Roman design, was expanded and modified to better accommodate Roman-style performances. Perhaps most significantly, Roman engineers modified the city's celebrated water management systems. While respecting the ingenuity of Nabataean hydraulic techniques, they incorporated their own approaches to water distribution, including the construction of nymphia, monumental public fountains that served both practical and symbolic functions, demonstrating Rome's mastery over natural resources. For the Nabataean elite, annexation often meant adaptation rather than disaster. Many noble families found places within the new provincial administration, trading loyalty to their former kingdom for positions of influence under Roman rule. Those who had already adopted Roman cultural practices found the transition easier, slipping into roles as local representatives of imperial authority. Some even gained Roman citizenship, a valuable status that offered legal protections and opportunities throughout the vast empire. The economic impact of annexation was complex and evolved over time. Initially, Petra benefited from incorporation into the broader Roman economic system, with its unified currency, legal frameworks for commerce, and extensive network of protected trade routes. Some evidence suggests an initial economic boom as Roman investments flowed into the new province, funding infrastructure projects and government operations. Yet underlying structural changes would eventually undermine Petra's commercial supremacy. The Romans preferred sea routes to overland caravan routes where possible, finding water transport more efficient and economical. Gradually, the Red Sea shipping lanes began to displace the traditional caravan routes through Nabataean territory. New ports rose in importance, while inland trading centers like Petra faced increasing competition. This shift was not immediate. Petra remained commercially important throughout the 2nd century CE, but the seeds of economic realignment had been planted. Cultural life in Petra under Roman rule reflected a deepening synthesis of Nabataean and Roman elements. The traditional deities of the Nabataeans continued to be worshipped, but increasingly in forms influenced by Roman religious practices. Dushara became more formally identified with Jupiter, while Al-Uzza was associated with Venus. New temples incorporated Roman architectural elements, and rituals gradually shifted toward Roman forms. Yet beneath these changes, many distinctly Nabataean religious practices persisted, particularly in private devotions and local festivals. The Roman legal system was imposed throughout the new province, bringing standardized procedures and punishments that sometimes conflicted with traditional Nabataean approaches to justice. Family law, property rights, and commercial regulations all fell under Roman jurisdiction, requiring adjustment by the local population. Yet Roman administrators often showed pragmatic flexibility, allowing local customs to continue when they did not directly contradict imperial priorities. Language patterns shifted gradually in response to Roman rule. Latin became the language of administration and military affairs, while Greek, already widely used in commercial contexts, gained further prominence as the empire's cultural lingua franca. Nabataean Aramaic continued to be spoken and written, though increasingly confined to domestic and religious contexts, rather than official ones. This linguistic transformation would have profound long-term effects, contributing to the gradual erosion of distinct Nabataean identity. The military presence of Rome was felt immediately and remained a constant reminder of imperial authority. A legionary garrison was established in the region, though not directly in Petra itself. Roman military engineers set to work constructing the Via Nova Traiana, a major road that ran through former Nabataean territory, connecting Syria to the Red Sea. This highway, parts of which remain visible today, served both military and commercial purposes, allowing rapid movement of troops while facilitating trade and tax collection. Taxation under Roman rule was typically more systematic, and sometimes heavier than under the Nabataean kings. The Romans introduced new taxes and regularized collection methods, reducing opportunities for negotiation or exemption that had existed in the previous system. Census records were maintained to track population and property ownership, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that extended imperial control into everyday life. Tax revenues now flowed to Rome, rather than supporting local projects and elites, representing a significant economic shift. Despite these changes, evidence suggests that many aspects of daily life in Petra continued with minimal disruption in the early decades of Roman rule. Archaeological findings from domestic contexts show continuity in cooking practices, household organization, and craft production. Ordinary citizens adapted to new political realities while maintaining cultural practices that defined their community identity. One significant change brought by Roman rule was increased connection to broader imperial currents. Petra became more tightly integrated into Mediterranean networks of trade, communication, and culture. Ideas, fashions, and technologies flowed more readily into the city, while ambitious Nabataeans now had expanded opportunities to travel, study, and work throughout the empire. This integration brought benefits, but also accelerated the dilution of distinctive Nabataean traditions. The physical boundaries of the city expanded during the early Roman period, with new residential areas developing. Beyond the original center, public spaces were reorganized according to Roman urban planning principles, emphasizing orthogonal street layouts and formal civic centers. The construction of a nymphaeum and other decorative water features displayed Roman aesthetic preferences, while showcasing the continued abundance of water that had always been one of Petra's most remarkable features. Administrative functions were housed in new or repurposed buildings that reflected Roman governmental needs. The establishment of archives, courts, and offices created physical spaces where the mechanisms of imperial rule operated daily. These buildings, with their distinctly Roman architectural vocabulary, served as constant visual reminders of the new political order. For many residents of Petra, Roman rule brought an ironic combination of greater connectivity with the wider world and reduced local autonomy. Decisions that had once been made by the Nabataean king and his advisors were now determined by officials answerable to a distant emperor. Local priorities sometimes gave way to imperial objectives, particularly regarding resource allocation and tax policies. Yet life under Rome also brought certain advantages. The famous Pax Romana, Roman peace, reduced conflicts between formerly competing kingdoms, creating more stable conditions for travel and trade across vast territories. Roman citizenship, eventually extended to increasing numbers of provincial residents, provided legal protections previously unavailable. Access to Roman markets opened new opportunities for Nabataean products and services. As the 2nd century progressed, the initial shock of annexation faded into memory. A generation grew up knowing only Roman rule, seeing themselves as provincial Romans rather than conquered Nabataeans. The cultural synthesis deepened, creating a hybrid identity that preserved elements of Nabataean heritage within an increasingly Romanized framework. The monuments of Petra now told two stories: the original Nabataean achievement and its Roman adaptation, coexisting in stone as they did in the minds of the city's inhabitants. In the twilight hours, as shadows lengthened across Petra's valleys, the Roman legionaries completing their patrols might pass Nabataean merchants closing their shops, exchange greetings in a mixture of Latin and Aramaic, and continue on their separate ways, each embodying the complex reality of a city between worlds, no longer fully Nabataean, yet never completely Roman. This cultural interweaving, with its tensions and accommodations, would define Petra through the remainder of its ancient prosperity, leaving traces that archaeologists would uncover centuries later, piecing together the story of a remarkable transition. The wind whispers through the carved facades as night falls over Petra, carrying echoes of prayers to Dushara, now mingled with invocations to Jupiter, the sounds of both Nabataean and Roman, music fading into the darkness. While high above, the same stars that guided caravans for centuries continue their eternal passage, indifferent to the changing flags and shifting allegiances below. Greatest generals took possession of the city. The Nabataean kingdom fell, not with a great battle as one might expect of such a powerful civilization, but through a quiet political annexation that forever changed Petra's destiny. And so began the Roman era of Petra, a period of significant architectural and cultural transformation. The Romans, with their practical mindset and imperial ambitions, viewed Petra differently than the Nabataeans had. Where the Nabataeans saw a sacred landscape worthy of monumental tombs and temples, the Romans saw a strategic administrative center in need of imperial amenities. The transition was not immediate, yet within a generation, Petra began to reflect its new identity as part of the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. As evening light once painted the sandstone cliffs in deepening hues of crimson and amber, Roman architects and engineers reimagined Petra's urban landscape. The colonnaded street, a hallmark of Roman civic planning, began to take shape along what had been the city's main thoroughfare. Marble columns rose where there had once been only the natural corridors of sandstone, their capitals adorned with Corinthian acanthus leaves that caught the desert light in ways wholly different from the austere Nabataean capitals that had come before. The Romans admired efficiency and spectacle in equal measure, and their transformation of Petra reflected both priorities. They widened and paved the city's streets, installing elaborate drainage systems beneath them. At the heart of the city, they constructed a grand nymphaeum, a monumental public fountain that celebrated the very water that had drawn the Nabataeans to this place centuries before. Water that had once flowed discreetly through the Nabataean clay pipes now danced and played in public celebration, cascading over ornamental tiers as citizens gathered to collect it in their vessels, and perhaps pause for conversation in its cooling mist. The theatre that the Nabataeans had carved into the rose-coloured stone was enlarged under Roman supervision, its seating capacity expanded to accommodate thousands. Here, where once only Nabataean voices had echoed against the sandstone walls. Now Latin and Greek mingled with Aramaic and Arabic as traveling troupes performed classical dramas and comedies. The theatre's expanded form, with its more pronounced scène fronds backdrop, reflected Rome's passion for dramatic spectacle, bringing a touch of distant Mediterranean culture to this desert crossroads. Perhaps most significantly, the Romans constructed a new civic center beside the colonnaded street. This was the heart of Roman administrative life, a space defined by columned porticos and official buildings where the business of empire could be conducted. Archaeological evidence suggests the presence of a basilica here, a multi-purpose building where legal matters were settled and commerce was regulated according to Roman law. For the residents of Petra, this space represented the most tangible sign of their new status as subjects of Rome. The great temple complex, which had served as a religious and perhaps political center under the Nabataeans, was modified to better serve Roman sensibilities. The forecourt was embellished, and the theatre that formed part of the complex was reconfigured to serve new ceremonial functions. Roman architectural elements, arches, barrel vaults, and decorative motifs began to appear alongside and sometimes overlay the earlier Nabataean features. As these physical transformations reshaped Petra's urban landscape, more subtle cultural changes were occurring as well. The Nabataean script gradually gave way to Greek and Latin inscriptions on public monuments. Coins minted in Petra now bore the profile of the Roman emperor rather than the Nabataean king. Religious practices began to shift as the pantheon of Roman deities was introduced alongside the traditional Nabataean gods. Yet these changes did not erase Petra's identity entirely. The Romans were pragmatic rulers who often allowed local customs and beliefs to continue as long as they did not interfere with imperial administration. They recognized the practical wisdom in many Nabataean innovations, particularly in water management, and maintained these systems rather than replacing them. The terraced gardens that had made Petra an oasis continued to flourish, their irrigation systems a testament to the enduring legacy of Nabataean engineering, even under Roman rule. For ordinary citizens of Petra, daily life under Roman rule brought both continuities and changes. The marketplace still bustled with activity, though now transactions might be conducted in Roman denarii rather than Nabataean coins. Caravans still arrived from distant lands, bringing exotic goods and news from across the empire. Local craftspeople continued to produce their distinctive thin-walled pottery, though they gradually incorporated Roman forms and decorative elements into their repertoire. Travelers' accounts from this period describe Petra as a prosperous provincial city, one where the grandeur of Rome was imposed upon, but did not entirely obliterate the unique character of the place. The city remained an important regional center, though its role in the wider trading networks began to shift as Rome developed new maritime routes that bypassed the traditional desert caravans. Among the most significant developments of this period was the construction of the monumental gateway that marked the entrance to the colonnaded street. Known today as the Temenos Gate, this structure signified the formalization of Petra's urban space according to Roman principles. Visitors passing through this imposing entrance would have understood immediately that they were entering a city that belonged to the Roman world, even as the rose-colored cliffs around them spoke of an older indigenous tradition. The bath complex constructed during this period further emphasized Petra's Roman identity. The public baths, with their caldaria, hot rooms, tepidaria, warm rooms, and frigidaria, cold rooms, introduced the Roman bathing culture to the desert city. These were not merely places for personal hygiene, but social spaces where business was discussed, friendships formed, and the rituals of Roman civic life enacted. The hypercourse system that heated the floors and walls of these baths represented a sophisticated application of Roman engineering in a desert environment. As twilight settled over the city each evening, oil lamps would be lit along the colonnaded street, their gentle glow reflecting off marble columns and illuminating the faces of citizens returning home after a day's work. The sounds of multiple languages, Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Nabataean, would mingle in the cooling air as merchants closed their stalls and families gathered for evening meals. Above it all, rose the distinctive call of desert birds returning to their nests in the high cliffs, a reminder that despite the imposition of Roman order, nature remained a powerful presence in this remarkable place. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the blending of cultural influences in everyday objects. Pottery fragments show Nabataean forms decorated with Roman motifs. Jewelry combines traditional desert designs with techniques imported from Italy and Greece. Even the food consumed by Petra's inhabitants reflected this cultural hybridization, with Mediterranean olives and wines appearing alongside traditional Nabataean staples. For approximately 2 centuries, Petra prospered under Roman administration. The city's strategic location ensured its continued importance, even as the focus of trade gradually shifted away from the traditional caravan routes. Roman military units stationed nearby provided security and stimulated the local economy through their needs and spending. Roman officials oversaw the administration of justice and the collection of taxes, integrating Petra into the vast bureaucratic network that maintained the empire. Yet beneath this apparent stability, subtle changes were occurring in the wider regional context that would eventually alter Petra's fortunes. The development of maritime trade routes through the Red Sea reduced the importance of the overland routes that had been Petra's lifeblood. The rise of Palmyra to the north and the growing importance of Egyptian ports diverted trade away from the traditional paths through Nabataean territory. Moreover, the administrative center of the Roman province gradually shifted away from Petra to Bostra, modern Bosra in Syria, diminishing Petra's political importance, even as it remained a significant regional city. These changes occurred slowly, over generations, and would not have been immediately apparent to those living through them. Life in Roman Petra continued with its rhythms of commerce and religious observance, its public spectacles and private devotions. As the 3rd century CE approached, new challenges emerged for the Roman Empire as a whole, and these too would affect Petra's destiny. Political instability in Rome itself, with emperors rising and falling in quick succession, disrupted the smooth functioning of provincial administration. Economic pressures, including inflation and currency devaluation, rippled outward from the imperial center to affect even distant cities like Petra, and then, in the year 363 CE, nature delivered a devastating blow. An earthquake of tremendous magnitude shook the region, toppling buildings and damaging much of Petra's infrastructure, including the vital water management systems that had sustained life in this arid environment for centuries. The destruction was extensive, affecting both the Roman additions to the city and the older Nabataean structures. The earthquake marked a turning point in Petra's history. While rebuilding occurred in some areas, the city never fully recovered its former glory. The damaged water systems compromised the city's ability to support its population, and changing economic conditions made it difficult to finance extensive repairs. Gradually, certain neighborhoods were abandoned, their buildings left to crumble back into the desert sands. As the light of Roman imperial power began to dim across the Mediterranean world, a new spiritual illumination was spreading through the cities and villages of what had once been Nabataean territory. The 4th century brought profound transformations to the ancient world, and Petra was not exempt from these currents of change. In 324 CE, Constantine the Great established Christianity as the favored religion of the Roman Empire, setting in motion a cultural and religious revolution that would eventually reach even this remote desert city. The seeds of Christianity had likely been planted in Petra even before Constantine's conversion. Early Christian travelers may have passed through the city, sharing their faith in quiet conversations and small gatherings. But it was in the Byzantine period, as scholars now call the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, after the 4th century, that Christianity truly took root and flourished among the rose-colored cliffs. The transition was gradual, as is often the case with profound cultural changes. For a time, the old gods and the new faith coexisted in Petra's sacred spaces. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Nabataean holy sites continued to receive offerings even as the first Christian communities established themselves in the city. In the markets and along the colonnaded street, followers of Dushara and Al-Uzza might pass Christian neighbors with a nod of recognition, each group secure in their own beliefs, yet sharing the mundane concerns of desert life. Byzantine Petra emerged slowly from the shadows of its Roman and Nabataean past. The most visible signs of this transformation were architectural. In the 5th and 6th centuries CE, several churches were constructed in Petra, their presence announcing the city's new spiritual orientation. These buildings represented not just new religious practices, but a fundamental shift in how the residents of Petra understood their relationship to the divine and to each other. The most impressive of these ecclesiastical buildings was the Petra church, constructed in the 5th century on a hill overlooking the colonnaded street. Archaeological investigations have revealed that this structure was built on the foundations of an earlier Nabataean building, a physical manifestation of the spiritual palimpsest that Petra had become. The church featured an elegant basilica plan with a central nave flanked by side aisles separated by columns. Its most remarkable feature was its floor, covered in elaborate mosaics depicting animals, plants, and geometric patterns, all executed in brilliant colors that must have seemed to capture the light of heaven itself. These mosaics tell us much about Byzantine Petra. Their artistic sophistication suggests the presence of skilled craftspeople and the financial resources to employ them. The iconographic program, which carefully avoided human figures in keeping with local sensitivities, reveals a thoughtful adaptation of Christian artistic conventions to the cultural context of Arabia. And the very fact that such an elaborate floor was commissioned suggests the importance of this church to Petra's Christian community. Not far from the Petra church stood the Ridge Church, sometimes called the Blue Chapel, because of the distinctive blue Egyptian marble used in its construction. This smaller structure served a different segment of Petra's Christian population, perhaps a monastic community or a particular neighborhood. Its location on a ridge overlooking the city's southern districts provided magnificent views of the surrounding landscape, a landscape now interpreted through a Christian lens, where the beauty of creation testified to the glory of its creator. A third significant Christian building, known today as the Urn Tomb Church, represented an even more direct appropriation of Nabataean sacred space. One of the grand tomb facades carved into the cliff face, originally created to house the remains of a Nabataean royal or noble family, was converted into a church in 446 CE. An inscription on the wall commemorates the dedication of this converted space on May 24th of that year, during the episcopate of the Most Holy and Blessed Jason. The reuse of this monumental tomb as a Christian worship space symbolized the transition of spiritual authority in the most visible way possible. These churches were not merely buildings but centers of community life. In Byzantine Petra, the rhythms of the liturgical year replaced the older festival cycles that had honored Nabataean deities. The sound of Christian hymns echoed in spaces where once incense had been offered to Dushara. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals, the ceremonies that marked life's significant transitions, now took place under the sign of the cross rather than in the presence of the beetle stones that had represented Nabataean gods. Beyond these architectural transformations, archaeological evidence gives us glimpses of daily life in Byzantine Petra. Pottery fragments from this period show a continuation of local production techniques, but with new Christian symbols, crosses, fish, and vines, appearing in the decorative repertoire. Lamps bearing Christian motifs illuminated homes and churches alike. Personal ornaments like rings and pendants frequently incorporated crosses or other Christian emblems, suggesting that residents of Petra openly identified with their new faith. And extraordinary discovery made in the Petra Church in 1993 provided unprecedented insight into Byzantine Petra. During excavations, archaeologists uncovered a cache of carbonized papyrus scrolls, nearly 140 in total, preserved when fire swept through the church in the late 6th century. These documents, written in Greek and dating from the 530s to the 570s CE, are largely legal texts concerning property transactions, tax records, and disputes among Petra's residents. The Petra papyri, as they are now known, paint a vivid picture of life in the Byzantine city. They reveal a community still engaged in agriculture and trade, with olive groves, vineyards, and orchards mentioned repeatedly in property descriptions. They document a functioning legal system that combined Byzantine law with local customs. And they preserve the names of Petra's residents, names that reflect the cultural mixing of the region, with Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Arabic elements, all present. These documents also hint at the social structure of Byzantine Petra. We read of wealthy landowners like Theodoros, son of Obodianos, a name preserving the memory of the Nabataean deity Obodas, who owned multiple properties in and around the city. We encounter clergy members like Archdeacon John, whose position gave him both spiritual and administrative responsibilities. And we glimpse ordinary citizens like the widow Stephanus, struggling to defend her modest inheritance against the claims of relatives. The religious life of Byzantine Petra extended beyond the city itself. On nearby Jabal Harun, Aaron's mountain, Byzantine Christians established a monastery dedicated to Moses' brother Aaron, whom they believed had died on this mountain. The monastery complex included a church, monks' cells, and facilities for pilgrims who came to venerate this Old Testament figure. The continuing importance of this site, which had likely been sacred to the Nabataeans as well, demonstrates how Christian practice in the region incorporated and reinterpreted earlier sacred geographies. Petra's bishops participated in the broader life of the Byzantine Church. Records show that Bishop Jason of Petra attended the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE, where crucial theological matters were debated. The city's ecclesiastical importance is further attested by its status as an archdiocese, with authority over several subordinate bishoprics in the surrounding region. This integration into the imperial church hierarchy connected Petra to Constantinople, Alexandria, and other centers of Byzantine Christianity. Yet even as Christianity transformed Petra's spiritual landscape, the physical challenges of desert life remained constant. The water management systems that had sustained the city for centuries still required maintenance and occasional repair. Fields still needed irrigation, and trade still depended on the security of caravan routes. Byzantine administrators inherited these practical concerns from their Roman and Nabataean predecessors, adding Christian prayers for rain and bountiful harvests to the more tangible efforts to secure the city's prosperity. By the mid-6th century, Petra had become a thoroughly Christian city, its physical and cultural landscape reshaped by 2 centuries of Byzantine influence. The old gods had faded into memory, their sanctuaries repurposed or abandoned. The rhythms of Christian worship, daily prayers, Sunday liturgies, and annual feast days structured both communal and personal life. Crosses adorned doorways and public spaces, visually proclaiming the city's faith. And then, in 551 CE, disaster struck once again. Another powerful earthquake shook the region, causing widespread damage to Petra's buildings, including its churches and water systems. This natural catastrophe came at a particularly vulnerable moment in Petra's history. The city had already been losing economic importance as trade routes shifted, and imperial resources for rebuilding were limited by the ambitious military campaigns of Emperor Justinian. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of this earthquake's impact. In some buildings, hasty repairs are visible, walls rebuilt with reused materials, architectural elements repurposed in pragmatic rather than aesthetic ways. In other areas, damaged structures were simply abandoned, their stone blocks gradually carried away for use elsewhere. The Petra papyri themselves were preserved because of this disaster, sealed in a room of the burning church and forgotten until modern archaeologists uncovered them. While Petra was not immediately abandoned after this earthquake, the event accelerated the city's decline. Some neighborhoods were never rebuilt, their residents relocating to other parts of the city or leaving Petra entirely. The sophisticated water management systems, already damaged by the earlier earthquake of 363 CE, suffered further deterioration, compromising the city's ability to support its population. Yet life in Byzantine Petra continued, albeit on a reduced scale. The Petra church was repaired and remained in use. Some residential areas continued to be occupied, particularly those near functioning water sources. Trade, while diminished, did not cease entirely. Petra's Christians continued to practice their faith, perhaps finding in it a source of solace and resilience in the face of natural disasters and economic challenges. As the 6th century gave way to the 7th, new forces were gathering on the Arabian Peninsula that would eventually transform the entire region. In 629-632 CE, the early Muslim conquests brought Byzantine territories in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt under Islamic rule. Petra, like other Byzantine cities in the region, passed relatively peacefully into this new political reality. The winds that swept through Petra's silent corridors at the dawn of the 7th century carried whispers of change. The Byzantine world was contracting, its resources strained by wars with Persia and internal political struggles. In this twilight moment, when the certainties of Byzantine rule were fading, but the new order had not yet fully emerged, Petra stood at a crossroads of history, a city whose glorious past was increasingly at odds with its diminished present. The process of Petra's decline had begun long before the arrival of Islam in the region. The earthquakes of 363 and 551 CE had inflicted serious damage on the city's infrastructure, particularly its ingenious water management systems. Without the consistent maintenance these systems required, certain areas of the city became increasingly difficult to inhabit. Archaeological evidence reveals a pattern of abandonment in Petra's outer districts, with population gradually concentrating in areas where water remained available. Economic factors also contributed to Petra's declining fortunes. The maritime trade routes through the Red Sea had been drawing commerce away from the traditional desert caravan paths for centuries. Byzantine imperial policy had increasingly favored these sea routes, particularly for the valuable trade with India and Ethiopia, as fewer caravans passed through Nabataean territory. Petra's role as a commercial hub inevitably diminished. The political center of the region had also shifted. Under the Romans, the provincial capital had moved from Petra to Bostra. In the Byzantine period, administrative functions were increasingly concentrated in cities like Jerusalem and Damascus. Petra remained a religious center with its churches and bishop, but its political importance had waned, and with it the imperial attention and resources that had once sustained its grandeur. When Muslim armies arrived in the region around 629-632 CE, they encountered a Petra that was already a shadow of its former self, still inhabited but no longer prosperous or expansive. The transition to Islamic rule appears to have been relatively peaceful. Archaeological evidence suggests no widespread destruction or conflict in Petra during this period. Instead, the arrival of Islam began a more subtle transformation of the city and region. Under the early caliphates, first the Rashidun, 632-661 CE, and then the Umayyad, 661-750 CE, Petra continued to be inhabited, though on an increasingly modest scale. The Muslim rulers were generally tolerant of existing Christian communities, allowing them to maintain their churches and religious practices in exchange for the payment of a special tax known as the jizya. The archaeological record from this period shows a gradual adaptation of existing structures to new purposes. Some Byzantine buildings were modified for Islamic use, with new architectural elements reflecting Muslim aesthetic and religious preferences. In other cases, the stones from damaged or abandoned buildings were recycled to construct smaller structures, more suited to the reduced population. Pottery fragments and other artifacts from this transitional period reveal the blending of Byzantine and early Islamic styles, a material reflection of the cultural hybridization that was occurring as the region's inhabitants adjusted to new political and religious realities. Local craftspeople continued to work in traditional techniques while incorporating new motifs and forms from the broader Islamic world. The Christian community in Petra appears to have persisted for some time under Islamic rule. The Petra Church may have remained in use through the 7th century, although with modifications to accommodate the diminished Christian population. Gradually, however, conversion to Islam reduced the size of this community. By the end of the Umayyad period, in the mid-8th century, Christianity in Petra had declined significantly, though it did not disappear entirely. The Abbasid Caliphate, 750–1258 CE, shifted the center of Islamic power eastward from Damascus to Baghdad, further diminishing Petra's geopolitical significance. The new rulers focused their resources on developing cities that were more centrally located within their empire. Petra, already marginal under the Umayyads, became even more peripheral under Abbasid administration. It was during this period that Petra experienced its most significant population decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the 9th century, large portions of the ancient city had been abandoned. The once bustling colonnaded street fell silent, its marble columns toppling one by one as earthquakes rattled the region and human hands carried away usable materials for new construction elsewhere. The intricate water management systems that had sustained Petra through its glory days could no longer be maintained by the reduced population, as cisterns cracked and channels became blocked with silt. Access to water, always the most precious resource in this desert environment, became increasingly difficult. Without reliable water sources, sustainable urban life became impossible in many parts of the city. By the 10th century, Petra was no longer recognizable as the magnificent city it had once been. Most of the urban area lay abandoned, with only a small settlement remaining in the most habitable section. The monumental tombs and temples carved into the rose-colored cliffs stood empty, their purposes forgotten by the few residents who remained in their shadows. Yet abandonment did not mean complete desertion. Throughout this period of decline, small groups of people continued to inhabit portions of the ancient city or its immediate surroundings. Some were likely descendants of Petra's original population, maintaining a tenuous connection to the place their ancestors had built. Others were nomadic Bedouin who used the ruins seasonally, finding shelter in the ancient structures during their cyclical movements through the desert landscape. The Islamic geographer al-Muqaddasi, writing in the late 10th century, mentioned Petra, which he called al-Batra, as a small town in the district of al-Sharat. His brief description suggests that while the settlement was modest, it was not entirely forgotten or uninhabited. Other Arabic sources occasionally mention the place, though often in passing, and without the detailed descriptions that would suggest it remained a significant urban center. Nature began to reclaim what humans had built. Flash floods, always, a danger in this desert environment. Swept through the CQ and city center without the sophisticated drainage systems that had once channeled these waters safely. Each flood deposited silt and debris, gradually raising the ground level and burying the lower portions of buildings. Windblown sand filled abandoned rooms and courtyards. Seeds carried by birds took root in cracks between stones, their growing roots slowly prizing apart the carefully fitted blocks. The 11th century brought new political developments to the region with the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the arrival of Turkish Seljuk forces from the east. These shifts in regional power had little direct impact on Petra itself, which by this time was a marginal settlement of little strategic or economic value. Life continued in its reduced form, with small groups adapting to the challenges of inhabiting a largely abandoned city. It was in this state of advanced decline that Petra entered one of the more colorful chapters in its long history, the Crusader period. Beginning in 1096 CE, European armies embarked on a series of military campaigns aimed at recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. By the early 12th century, these Crusader forces had established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which included territories east of the Jordan River. In the shadow of Petra's towering facades, time moved differently during what historians now call the Silent Centuries. This period, stretching roughly from the 12th to the early 19th century, saw the once magnificent city fade almost completely from the consciousness of the wider world. Yet even in silence and obscurity, Petra was never entirely empty or forgotten. Its story during these centuries is one of adaptation, resilience, and the quiet persistence of human presence in a landscape that had once hosted greatness. The Crusader period brought brief but significant activity to Petra and its surroundings. Around 1115 CE, Baldwin I, king of Jerusalem, ordered the construction of a fortress on a mountaintop overlooking the ancient city. This stronghold, known as Livo Mois, the Valley of Moses, to the Crusaders and later as Al-Wu'ayra, was part of a defensive network designed to protect the eastern frontiers of the Crusader states. The fortress took advantage of Petra's natural defensive position, with steep cliffs on three sides and a single narrow approach that could be easily defended. Archaeological investigations at Al-Wu'ayra reveal a well-planned fortification with thick walls, towers, and a chapel. The Crusaders, like those who had built in Petra before them, made use of the abundant local sandstone, supplemented by reused blocks from earlier structures. Water cisterns carved into the bedrock ensured a reliable supply during times of siege. From this elevated position, Crusader guards could survey the surrounding landscape, watching for approaching forces and protecting the pilgrimage routes that passed nearby. The Crusader presence in Petra was relatively brief. In 1188 CE, Saladin's forces captured Al-Wu'ayra, along with most other Crusader holdings east of the Jordan. The fortress was partially dismantled to prevent its reuse, and the European knights who had briefly made this desert outpost their home returned to their own lands or moved to the remaining Crusader territories along the Mediterranean coast. After the departure of the Crusaders, Petra entered a period of deeper obscurity. The Ayyubid dynasty, 1171–1341 CE, founded by Saladin, and the Mamluk Sultanate, 1250–1517 CE, that followed it, focused their attention on more strategically important areas. Cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem flourished under their rule, while Petra, remote and economically marginal, received little administrative attention. Yet life in and around Petra did not cease entirely. Small communities of semi-nomadic Bedouin used the area seasonally, finding shelter in the ancient rock-cut chambers during winter months and migrating to higher elevations during the summer heat. These groups, primarily from the Badul tribe, developed an intimate knowledge of Petra's landscape, its hidden water sources, sheltered valleys, and defensive positions. They considered themselves the guardians of the ancient city, even as its history faded from their collective memory, replaced by local legends and folklore. These Bedouin inhabitants adapted some of Petra's ancient structures to serve their needs. Rock-cut tombs became seasonal dwellings, their spacious interiors providing shelter from sun and rain. The theatre that had once echoed with classical dramas occasionally housed flocks of goats, its tiered seating forming convenient corrals. And the sophisticated water catchment systems, though largely fallen into disrepair, still collected enough seasonal rainfall to support small-scale agriculture in some areas. Evidence of this Bedouin presence appears in the form of smoke-blackened ceilings in many of Petra's rock-cut chambers, the residue of centuries of cooking fires. Small modifications to doorways and interiors reflect practical adaptations to make these ancient spaces more suitable for their new inhabitants. Graffiti carved into the sandstone records names and tribal marks, a humble continuation of the human impulse to leave one's mark that had once produced Petra's grand facades. During this period, knowledge of Petra became increasingly fragmentary and mythologized in the wider world. Arab geographers occasionally mentioned the site, but their descriptions were often vague or confused with other places. European awareness of the ancient city diminished even further, with medieval maps showing little accurate information about the territories east of the Dead Sea. Petra became enveloped in an obscurity so complete that many scholars doubted whether it had ever truly existed as described in ancient texts. The Ottoman Empire, which gained control of the region in 1516 to 17 CE, maintained only nominal authority over the areas around Petra for much of its rule. The desert tribal groups, including those who used Petra seasonally, largely governed themselves according to traditional customs. Ottoman tax registers occasionally mention settlements in the vicinity, but Petra itself, by now reduced to a tribal territory rather than a proper settlement, rarely appears in official documents. The 17th and 18th centuries saw European interest in the antiquities of the Near East begin to grow, spurred partly by the Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts. Scholars and adventurers began to travel through Ottoman territories, documenting ancient sites and collecting artifacts. Yet Petra remained elusive, protected by its remote location and by the Bedouin tribes who regarded outsiders with understandable suspicion. Several European travelers attempted to reach Petra during this period, drawn by vague references in classical sources and local rumors of a remarkable city carved from rose-colored stone. Most were turned back by local guides who either did not know the exact location or deliberately misled them to protect tribal territories. Others were discouraged by demands for exorbitant payments or by warnings of danger. Petra maintained its secrets, waiting for the right moment and the right traveler to reintroduce it to the world. That moment came in 1812, when a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt conceived a plan to discover the lost city. Understanding that direct inquiries about Petra would arouse suspicion, Burckhardt adopted a disguise and an ingenious strategy. He presented himself as a Muslim scholar named Ibrahim ibn Abdullah, dressed in local attire and spoke fluent Arabic. Rather than expressing interest in ancient ruins, he announced his intention to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, Jabal Harun, located near Petra. Burckhardt hired a guide from Wadi Musa, the settlement nearest to Petra, and set off on Sa'd, his ostensibly religious journey. As they approached the ancient city, Burckhardt had to contain his excitement and maintain his disguise, making notes and observations as discreetly as possible. When they passed through the Sikh and the Treasury facade suddenly appeared before him, he later wrote that he had to pretend indifference while beholding one of the most elegant remains of antiquity existing in Syria. Burckhardt's discipline paid off. He was able to spend several hours exploring Petra, making mental notes of its major monuments and features. Though he could not linger as long as he wished without arousing suspicion, his observations were detailed, enough to confirm that this was indeed the Petra described in ancient sources. Upon returning to civilization, he documented his discovery in his journal, though his account would not be published until after his untimely death from illness in 1817. Burckhardt's rediscovery marked the beginning of Petra's re-emergence into global consciousness, a process that would accelerate throughout the 19th century. As news of the Swiss explorers' findings spread through European academic circles, other travelers set their sights on the rose-colored city. Unlike Burckhardt, these later visitors often came with explicit permission from Ottoman authorities, and with arrangements made in advance with local tribal leaders. Among the most significant early visitors after Burckhardt was Léon de Laborde, a French scholar who reached Petra in 1828. Laborde brought a skilled artist, Louis-Maurice Auguste, Linant de Belfons, who produced the first detailed drawings of Petra's monuments. These images, published in Laborde's Voyage de l'Arabie Petrae, 1830, introduced European audiences to the visual splendors of the ancient city and sparked widespread fascination. The British travelers Charles Leonard Irby and James Mangles visited in 1818, followed by the Scottish painter David Roberts in 1839. Roberts' romantic lithographs of Petra, with their dramatic lighting and atmospheric quality, captured the public imagination and helped establish Petra as an emblem of exotic Oriental mystery. In European cultural consciousness, these early visitors faced considerable challenges. The journey to Petra was arduous, requiring weeks of travel through difficult terrain. Local tribes sometimes demanded substantial payments for access to the site, and provisions were scarce in this remote region. Yet the magnificence of the discovery made these hardships worthwhile for the intrepid travelers who made the journey. As the 19th century progressed, visits to Petra became more frequent, though still adventurous. Each new traveler added to the growing body of knowledge about the site. Some came with scientific interests, documenting inscriptions, measuring monuments, or collecting botanical specimens. Others were driven by religious motivations, seeking connections to biblical narratives. Still others came simply for the adventure, eager to experience a place that had acquired an almost mythical status. For the Bedouin inhabitants of Petra, This growing stream of foreign visitors brought both opportunities and challenges. Serving as guides or providing accommodation became new sources of income, supplementing traditional pastoral activities. Yet the increasing outside interest also brought unwelcome attention from Ottoman authorities, who began to assert greater control over the region in response to European activities there. The silent centuries had ended. Petra, which had slumbered in obscurity for so long, was awakening to find itself the object of global fascination. The 20th century would bring even more dramatic changes: archaeological excavations, tourism development, and eventually, UNESCO World Heritage status. But these developments belong to another chapter in Petra's remarkable story, a chapter that began with a disguised Swiss explorer who pretended indifference while his heart raced at the sight of the Treasury facade, emerging from the shadows of the sick. As the 19th century drew to a close, the foundations were being laid for a new era in Petra's history. The ancient city, which had witnessed the rise and fall of the Nabataeans, the pragmatic governance of Rome, the spiritual transformation brought by Christianity, and the long silence that followed, was about to embark on yet another transformation, this time as an archaeological treasure and a window into the ancient world for people from across the globe. For them remained a tantalizing vision, something deeply embedded in the memory of those who had once gazed upon its wonders. Travelers' accounts from the Middle Ages are sparse, yet there are occasional glimmers that suggest some knowledge of the site persisted in local traditions and tales, sometimes referred to simply as the Old City, or by other names now lost to time. Petra's true grandeur awaited rediscovery. The dawn of the 19th century brought with it a renewed European fascination with the ancient world. Explorers, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the allure of discovery, ventured into regions long considered inaccessible to Western travelers. Among these explorers was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss scholar whose name would forever be linked with the rediscovery of Petra. Born in 1784 to a wealthy family in Basel, Switzerland, Burckhardt had developed an early fascination with distant lands. His education at the universities of Leipzig and Göttingen nurtured this interest, particularly in Oriental studies. In 1809, while in his mid-20s, Burckhardt approached the Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior, parts of Africa, commonly known as the African Association, with a proposition. He offered to undertake an expedition to explore the source of the Niger River in Africa, a goal that had eluded European explorers for decades. The association, recognizing his capabilities and enthusiasm, agreed to sponsor his journey. However, this was no simple undertaking in the early 19th century. To travel safely through North Africa and the Middle East, Burckhardt knew he needed to adopt not just the language, but the entire persona of a Muslim traveler. Thus began his meticulous preparation. For 2 years, he immersed himself in Arabic studies at Cambridge University and in Syria, mastering the language with remarkable fluency. He adopted Arab dress, learned Islamic customs and prayers, and took the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdullah. His dedication to his disguise was complete. He lived as a Muslim trader, learned to recite passages from the Quran, and even underwent the physical hardships necessary to blend in with the Bedouin and merchant caravans with whom he traveled. By 1812, his transformation was so convincing that he moved freely through regions where European travelers would have faced grave danger. It was during this journey, in the summer of 1812, that Burckhardt heard tales of extraordinary ruins hidden among the mountains of Wadi Musa in present-day Jordan. The local Bedouin guarded knowledge of the site jealously, believing it contained treasures. With characteristic resourcefulness, Burckhardt conceived a plan. He would claim to be a pilgrim who had made a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, brother of Moses, which was said to be located on a mountain near these ruins. On August 22, 1812, guided by a local Bedouin reluctant to reveal the site, to an outsider, Burckhardt approached Petra through its eastern entrance. As he entered the narrow gorge of the Sick, the towering sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, he maintained his persona as a devoted pilgrim. yet within him must have stirred the excitement of the scholar who recognized the historical significance of what he was about to witness. When the Sikh finally opened to reveal the rose-red facade of the Treasury, Burckhardt became the first European in nearly 600 years to gaze upon this wonder. His guide, watchful and suspicious, gave him little time to examine the monuments. Despite these constraints, Burckhardt managed to make quick sketches and notes, documenting what he could, while maintaining his cover as Sheikh Ibrahim. In his journal, later published as Travels in Syria and the Holy Land, Burckhardt wrote, "In the red sandstone of which the valley is composed are upwards of 250 sepulchres entirely cut out of the rock, the greater part of them with Grecian ornaments. There is in addition a mausoleum in the shape of a temple, of colossal dimensions, likewise cut out of the rock, with a beautiful facade of columns." His prose was restrained, perhaps deliberately so, yet the importance of his discovery was clear to him. He had found the ancient capital of the Nabataeans, the city described by ancient writers, but lost to the West for centuries. Though he couldn't linger without arousing suspicion, his brief visit was enough to confirm the location and significance of Petra. Burckhardt's journal entry, comparing what he saw to ancient accounts, was the first step in reconnecting Petra to its historical context. He correctly identified the site as the ancient Nabataean capital, though much of its history remained obscure. His discovery, however, would not be immediately shared with the wider world. The cautious explorer continued his journey, maintaining his disguise and pursuing his broader mission. Tragically, Burckhardt would not live to see the full impact of his discovery. In 1817, at the age of just 32, he died of dysentery in Cairo, never having completed his intended expedition to discover the source of the Niger. His journals, published posthumously, brought Petra to the attention of European scholarly circles and triggered a wave of interest that would eventually transform the isolated ruins into one of the world's most famous archaeological sites. The first European visitors to follow in Burckhardt's footsteps arrived in 1818. William John Banks, an English traveller and collector of antiquities, along with his companions Thomas Legge, Charles Irby and James Mangles, managed to reach Petra despite resistance from local tribes. Unlike Burckhardt, they had the opportunity to examine the monuments more closely and to make more detailed drawings. Their accounts and illustrations began the process of bringing Petra's wonders to a wider audience. The 1830s saw further expeditions that would profoundly influence Western perceptions of Petra. In 1836, the Scottish artist David Roberts spent several days at the site, creating paintings and lithographs that captured the romantic grandeur of the ruins. His dramatic works, showing the treasury, the monastery, and other monuments against the backdrop of rugged mountains, sparked the imagination of Europeans and Americans. Roberts's artistic vision, with its emphasis on the exotic and sublime, helped create the enduring image of Petra as a mysterious, lost city. Other significant early visitors included the American scholar Edward Robinson and the French researcher Léon de Laborde, whose detailed descriptions and measurements advanced the scholarly understanding of the site. The flow of visitors increased, gradually, though Petra remained difficult to access, requiring extensive preparation, local guides, and negotiations with Bedouin tribes who controlled access to the site. By the mid-19th century, Petra had captured the imagination of the Victorian public. It became a symbol of the romance of archaeological discovery, a place where ancient wonders had slumbered in obscurity, waiting to be rediscovered. This perception was reinforced by the poetry and travel literature of the era, which often depicted Petra as a sublime embodiment of vanished glory. The English poet John William Burgon, without ever having visited Petra himself, penned lines in 1845 that would become forever associated with the site. In his prize-winning poem Petra, he described it as a rose-red city half as old as time. This poetic description, though not archaeologically precise, captured something essential about Petra's timeless quality and the distinctive hue of its stone facades. As the 19th century progressed, archaeological interest in Petra grew more systematic. The German explorers Ulrich Jasper Seitzen and Johann Ludwig Burckhardt had pioneered the way, but it was later scholars who began the painstaking work of mapping, measuring, and analyzing the site's monuments. The Czech scholar Alois Musil conducted important surveys in the early 1900s, as did the German researchers Gustav Dahlmann and Tadeusz Kahnen. A significant shift in the archaeological approach to Petra came with the work of George Horsfield, who served as Chief Inspector of Antiquities in Transjordan during the British Mandate period in the 1920s. Horsfield, together with his wife Agnes Conway and the architect William A. Stewart, conducted the first systematic excavations at Petra. Their work revealed that the site was far more complex than previously understood, with evidence of settlements extending back to prehistoric times. Another crucial figure in early Petra archaeology was Nelson Glueck, whose surveys in the 1930s placed the city in its broader regional context. Glueck recognized that Petra was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a complex network of Nabataean settlements and installations throughout the region. His work helped scholars understand how the city functioned within a larger economic and political system. The British archaeologist Philip Hammond, beginning in the 1960s, conducted extensive excavations at Petra that significantly expanded knowledge of the city's chronology and development. Meanwhile, the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, established after the country's independence, took an increasingly active role in the preservation and study of the site. Each of these explorers and scholars contributed to the gradual unveiling of Petra's secrets. The process was not simply one of physical discovery, but of intellectual recovery, as researchers pieced together the city's history from fragments of evidence. Archaeological techniques improved, allowing for more precise dating and analysis. Historical perspectives evolved, moving beyond the romantic view of a lost city to understand Petra as a living community that changed and adapted over centuries. By the mid-20th century, Petra had transitioned from a remote archaeological curiosity to an increasingly accessible site for tourism. The establishment of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946 brought political stability to the region and a new phase in Petra's modern history. The Jordanian government recognized the site's cultural and economic importance, taking steps to protect the monuments and develop infrastructure for visitors. The rediscovery of Petra represents more than just the physical finding of ancient ruins. It embodies a process of cultural recovery, whereby a place that had never truly been lost to local knowledge was reintegrated into global awareness. Burckhardt, with his scholarly caution and cultural sensitivity, began this process, and generations of explorers, archaeologists, and visitors have continued it, each adding to our understanding of this remarkable place. The journey of Petra from a rediscovered archaeological site to a global cultural icon and major tourist destination encompasses much of the modern history of Jordan itself. As the 20th century progressed, this ancient city became increasingly intertwined with contemporary concerns about heritage preservation, tourism development, and the representation of national identity. In the decades following Jordan's independence, archaeological work at Petra intensified. International expeditions, often working in collaboration with Jordanian authorities, undertook excavations throughout the site. Each project added new layers to the understanding of Petra's complex history. The American expedition to Petra, led by Philip Hammond from 1958 to the 1980s, made significant discoveries regarding the city's chronology and urban development. The Brown University Petra Great Temple Project, begun in 1993 under the direction of Martha Sharp Jukowski, revealed the previously unknown Great Temple Complex, demonstrating that major discoveries were still possible even after decades of exploration. Swiss and French teams focused on the hydraulic systems that had made life possible in this arid environment, while German archaeologists studied the Nabataean pottery that had been a distinctive product of the city. Jordanian archaeologists, trained at universities both at home and abroad, increasingly took leadership roles in research and conservation efforts. A turning point in Petra's modern history came in 1985, when UNESCO designated the site as a World Heritage Property. This recognition brought international attention and resources to conservation challenges, but also highlighted the pressures that increased tourism could place on fragile monuments. The UNESCO designation cited Petra as one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, where ancient Eastern traditions blend with Hellenistic architectural facades, noting its outstanding universal value as a cultural treasure belonging to all humanity. The growth of tourism accelerated dramatically in the following decades. From a few thousand visitors annually in the 1950s, Petra's visitor numbers grew to hundreds of thousands by the end of the 20th century. The 1989 film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which featured the Treasury as the entrance to a fictional temple housing the Holy Grail, introduced Petra to millions of moviegoers worldwide, creating a surge in popular interest. This increasing visitation brought both opportunities and challenges. Tourism became a vital economic resource for Jordan, and particularly for local communities around Petra. The Bedouin of the Badul tribe, who had lived in the caves of Petra until the 1980s, transitioned to new roles as guides, vendors, and providers of transportation. Their relocation to the nearby settlement of Sayhun was part of a complex process of adaptation as the site transformed from a remote archaeological zone to a managed park. Infrastructure developed to accommodate growing visitor numbers. A visitor center was established at the entrance to the SEQ. Hotels were constructed in nearby Wadi Musa, and pathways were improved throughout the site. These developments improved accessibility, but also raised questions about the balance between tourism and conservation. How could the economic benefits of tourism be maximized while minimizing impact on the fragile monuments? In 2007, Petra achieved another mark of global recognition when it was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world in a worldwide poll. This designation further increased the site's profile internationally and reflected its status as a symbol of human achievement and historical continuity. Conservation efforts intensified as awareness grew of the threats facing Petra's monuments. These challenges included natural processes such as erosion, weathering, and flash floods, as well as human impacts from tourism, development, and earlier well-intentioned but sometimes damaging restoration attempts. Organizations such as the Petra National Trust, established in 1989, worked to promote sustainable conservation practices and community engagement. Major international projects focused on specific conservation needs. The Petra Church Project, led by the American Center for Oriental Research, preserved the magnificent Byzantine-era mosaics discovered in the 1990s. The Temple of the Winged Lion's Cultural Resource Management Initiative combined archaeological research with training local community members in conservation techniques. The CQ Stability Project, a collaboration between Jordanian authorities and UNESCO, monitored and addressed rockfall risks in the narrow entrance gorge. Scientific techniques revolutionized the study and preservation of Petra. Laser scanning created precise three-dimensional models of monuments, allowing conservators to monitor deterioration with unprecedented accuracy. Ground-penetrating radar revealed structures hidden beneath the surface without the need for excavation. Sophisticated water management systems were installed to protect the site from the flash floods that had periodically caused damage throughout its history. Beyond these technical approaches, there was growing recognition of the need for a holistic management strategy that considered Petra not in isolation, but as part of a cultural landscape extending far beyond the boundaries of the archaeological park. The Petra Archaeological Park, formally established in 1993, encompassed 264 square kilometers, including not only the central city, but also outlying temples, tombs, and settlements. The broader regional context received increasing attention as, well, the Petra Region Planning Council worked to coordinate development in communities surrounding the park. Researchers documented the extensive network of Nabataean sites throughout southern Jordan, helping to distribute tourist interest beyond the central city and provide a more complete picture of the civilization that created Petra. Petra's significance in contemporary Jordan extends beyond archaeology and tourism. As a symbol of national identity, The ancient city appears on Jordanian currency and postage stamps. It features prominently in the country's promotional materials and diplomatic exchanges. For many Jordanians, Petra represents a tangible connection to a distinguished past, a source of pride in their cultural heritage. This national significance is balanced with recognition that Petra belongs to a shared human heritage. International cooperation has been a hallmark of research and conservation efforts. Projects have involved experts from Jordan, Europe, North America, Asia, and beyond, bringing diverse perspectives and expertise to the challenges of understanding and preserving the site. Education and outreach programs have sought to ensure that knowledge of Petra's history and significance reaches both local communities and global audiences. School curricula in Jordan include substantial content about the site's history. Museums in Petra and elsewhere in Jordan display artifacts and explain the cultural context of the monuments. Digital initiatives have made information and images accessible worldwide. The economic impact of Petra on modern Jordan has been substantial. Tourism directly related to the site creates thousands of jobs and generates significant revenue. The development of handicrafts, accommodation, transportation, and other services linked to tourism has diversified the regional economy. Recognition of this importance led to the creation of the Petra Development and Tourism Region Authority in 2009, tasked with managing development in ways that balance economic opportunities with heritage preservation. The vulnerability of tourism-dependent economies became starkly apparent during periods of regional instability and global crises. The Gulf War in 1991, episodes of unrest elsewhere in the Middle East, and most dramatically the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-2021, caused sharp declines in visitor numbers. These fluctuations highlighted the need for sustainable approaches that could protect both the archaeological site and the communities dependent on it through challenging times. Looking toward the future, Jordanian authorities and their international partners face complex questions about Petra's management. How can visitation be managed to avoid overcrowding at popular monuments while ensuring economic benefits? What balance should be struck between excavation of new areas and conservation of already exposed structures? How can local communities participate meaningfully in decision-making about a site of national and international importance? The answers to these questions continue to evolve as understanding of the site deepens and as the context around it changes. What remains constant is the recognition that Petra represents something extraordinary, a testament to human creativity and adaptation, a place where natural beauty and cultural achievement are inextricably linked. In the modern world, Petra has become many things: an archaeological wonder, a tourist destination, a symbol of national identity, a conservation challenge, an economic resource, and an educational opportunity. Its significance continues to unfold as new generations encounter and interpret its monuments, each bringing their own questions and perspectives to this remarkable place. The rose-red city of Petra stands as a testament to human ingenuity across the ages, a place where the past continues to speak to the present through stone carved by ancient hands. As we consider its enduring legacy, we must look beyond the magnificent facades to understand what Petra truly represents in our collective human journey. First and foremost, Petra embodies the remarkable achievement of adaptation to challenging environments. The Nabataeans' mastery of water management in an arid landscape demonstrates how human societies can thrive even in seemingly inhospitable settings through observation, innovation, and persistent effort. Their systems for collecting, storing, and distributing water transformed a desert gorge into a verdant oasis capable of supporting thousands of residents and welcoming countless travelers. In our era of increasing environmental challenges, These ancient solutions offer inspiration for sustainable approaches to resource management. Petra also stands as a monument to cultural exchange and integration. The city's architecture reflects a sophisticated blending of influences from across the ancient world: Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman elements, combined with local traditions to create something distinctively Nabataean. This hybridization was not mere imitation, but creative synthesis, adapting foreign ideas to local needs and aesthetics. The resulting monuments exhibit both cosmopolitan sophistication and cultural confidence, reminding us that innovation often flourishes at the intersection of diverse traditions. The economic history of Petra offers equally valuable insights. The Nabataeans' success in trade demonstrates the power of intermediaries who facilitate exchange between distant regions. Their prosperity came not from conquering territory, but from providing essential services: transportation, security, lodging, banking, and market access to traders moving between larger empires. By positioning themselves at crucial nodes in regional networks, they transformed their geographic position from a limitation into an advantage. This model of development through service provision, rather than resource extraction or territorial expansion, continues to have relevance for smaller nations in today's interconnected global economy. Petra's political legacy is subtler but equally significant. The Nabataean kingdom maintained its independence for centuries through a combination of military defense, diplomatic flexibility, and economic indispensability. Rather than confronting the Roman Empire directly, the Nabataeans employed strategic accommodation, preserving their autonomy while gradually adapting to the realities of Roman power. This pragmatic approach to asymmetric relationships between smaller and larger powers exemplifies how cultural and political identity can be maintained even within constraints imposed by geopolitical realities. The city's long decline and eventual abandonment also carry lessons about resilience and vulnerability. Petra did not collapse suddenly, but adapted repeatedly to changing circumstances, shifting trade patterns, political incorporation into the Roman Empire, religious transformation, and natural disasters. Each change brought adjustments in the city's function and population. This gradual transformation reminds us that even dramatic historical changes often unfold incrementally, with communities responding and adapting as best they can to forces beyond their control. It also demonstrates that no adaptation, however successful, guarantees permanence in the face of fundamental shifts in environmental or economic foundations. The rediscovery of Petra in the modern era illustrates how knowledge can be simultaneously preserved and forgotten. While the city never completely vanished from local awareness, its global significance was lost for centuries until Burckhardt's expedition reconnected it to broader historical narratives. This pattern of disconnection and reconnection characterizes much of our relationship with the past. Historical knowledge requires not just preservation, but active engagement, as each generation reinterprets ancient sites through the lens of contemporary concerns and values. Petra's current role as a World Heritage Site underscores questions about ownership and stewardship of cultural heritage. Who has the right to determine how such sites are managed and interpreted? How can we balance scholarly research, tourism development, conservation needs, and local economic interests? The ongoing dialogue between Jordanian authorities, international organizations, researchers, tourists, and local communities represents an evolving attempt to address these complex questions. The solutions developed at Petra contribute to broader discussions about heritage management worldwide. As a tourism destination, Petra exemplifies both the benefits and challenges of cultural tourism. Visitors bring economic opportunities and global awareness, but but also physical impacts on monuments and potential disruption of local traditions. The experience of viewing ancient monuments is itself transformed by the presence of other visitors, creating tensions between accessibility and authenticity. These dilemmas, faced at heritage sites worldwide, have no perfect solutions, but require ongoing negotiation and adaptation. In contemporary imagination, Petra occupies a special place. It has appeared in films, novels, video games, and travel, media as a symbol of mystery and discovery. These representations often simplify or romanticize the site's history, emphasizing its lost or hidden quality over its continuous human history. Such portrayals reveal as much about modern desires and preoccupations as they do about the ancient city itself. Our fascination with Petra reflects enduring human interests in hidden knowledge, bygone civilizations, and the physical evidence of time's passage. For archaeologists and historians, Petra continues to offer opportunities for discovery and reinterpretation. Despite more than a century of research, much remains unknown. New technologies allow previously invisible aspects of the site to be documented. Shifting theoretical perspectives enable fresh interpretations of familiar monuments. Questions once considered settled are reopened as evidence accumulates. This ongoing scholarly engagement ensures that our understanding of Petra continues to evolve, making it not just a monument to the past, but an active site of knowledge production. The preservation challenges at Petra highlight broader issues of cultural heritage protection in an era of climate change, development pressures, and mass tourism. The sandstone that made carving possible is also vulnerable to erosion. Ancient water management systems require maintenance to prevent destructive flooding. Tourism infrastructure must be developed thoughtfully to avoid damaging the very features that attract visitors. These challenges demand innovative solutions that respect both the site's historical integrity and its continued significance to contemporary communities. Perhaps most profoundly, Petra demonstrates the power of place to connect people across time. When visitors stand before the Treasury or climb to the high place of sacrifice today, they experience spaces that have moved and impressed human beings for over 2,000 years. Though their interpretations differ from those of ancient observers, this continuity of human engagement with built environment creates a tangible link between past and present. In a world of rapid change, such connections to history provide valuable perspective and grounding. The story of Petra is, in many ways, the story of human civilization in microcosm. It encompasses the fundamental human experiences of adaptation to environment, cultural exchange and synthesis, economic innovation and obsolescence, political negotiation, religious transformation, and the creation of beauty and meaning through built space. Its legacy lies not just in its spectacular monuments, but in what they reveal about human capabilities and aspirations across millennia. As the sun sets over Petra, casting long shadows across facades carved by hands now long vanished, we are reminded of both the impermanence of human works and their enduring power to inspire. The Nabataeans could not have imagined that their city would one day draw visitors from continents unknown to them, or that their water management techniques would be studied as models of sustainable design. Yet their achievements continue to resonate, speaking across centuries to remind us of our shared humanity and the quiet persistence of stone that outlasts empires. In the fading light of dusk, when the last visitors have departed and silence reclaims the ancient city, Petra breathes with memories thousands of years deep. The wind that whispers through the Seek carries echoes of camel caravans and merchant calls, of chisels striking stone and water flowing through ingenious channels. Time, moves differently here, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow erosion of sandstone, the gradual softening of once sharp edges. What human hands created, nature now gently reclaims, a dialogue between intention and dissolution played out over centuries. The stars emerge above the same mountains that watched over Nabataean ceremonies, Byzantine prayers, and Bedouin campfires. They shine on empty niches where deities once stood, on tombs whose occupants are long forgotten, on paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. This is Petra's final gift to us, a reminder that all achievements, however magnificent, eventually return to the elements from which they came. The rose-red city does not demand immortality, but offers instead a more profound lesson, that beauty lies in the impermanence, in the precious moment between creation and dissolution, when human vision stands briefly manifest in stone. As night deepens over the desert and the ancient facades merge with darkness, Petra slips back into the realm of dreams, not lost, but resting, perpetually caught in the timeless space between remembering and forgetting, between revelation and mystery, between the tangible world of stone and the intangible realm of wonder. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. Together, we'll explore forgotten worlds and ancient wonders as you drift peacefully into sleep.